Broadcasting your inclusion journey online, 18th to the 26th of November. You're listening to Reba Radio.
You are listening to Reba Radio, broadcasting live from the bookshop at 66 Portland Place. If you don't know, it's the HQ of the Royal Institute of British Architects. And we're broadcasting with me, Marsha Ramroop. I'm the Director of Inclusion here at the RIBA. I can't believe it. I can't believe it. We're 20 hours down. We've only got 8 hours to go in bringing you 28 hours of material to help you build inclusion into everything that you do. And it's all rooted in that behavioural principle of CQ, cultural intelligence. We're talking inclusive design. We're talking decolonising architecture. We're talking international architects. And we're talking organisational and self-awareness and impact. We're talking more CQ strategy. Welcome to day 6, the penultimate day of Reba Radio.
Reba Radio with Marsha Ramroop.
You are listening to Reba Radio with me, Marsha Ramroop, broadcasting live from the bookshop at 66 Portland Place, where you can hear the atmosphere of people moving, walking around, working here at the HQ of the Royal Institute of British Architects. Now, we had a bit of a practice yesterday, so let's see if I can get the team here today to do this. We're bringing you... Oh my gosh, they're so lackluster. Come on, guys, we're bringing you 28 hours of material to help you build inclusion into everything you do. And what's it rooted in?
The principle of CQ.
And what's CQ stand for?
Cultural intelligence.
Oh my goodness. They still need work, don't they? So far, we've given you an overview of CQ, unconscious bias, inclusion in architecture. We've spoken about the first two CQ capabilities, CQ drive, how much do you want to work with those different from you, what motivations can you work on, especially when it's tough, and CQ knowledge, which is what do you know, what are you thinking about regarding others. We spoke about some lived experiences, women, race, disability, LGBTQ plus lives and socioeconomic disadvantage. And coming up today, it's our second of 2 days talking CQ strategy, which is thinking about what you're thinking about. So planning interactions, checking your assumptions and self-awareness. It's about creating procedural changes to mitigate the impact of hidden bias. And that means talking inclusive design with Marvin Rees, Julie Fleck, Zoe Partington and Ian McKinnon. Decolonisation with Dr. Neil Chassor, Professor Corinne Fowler, Harsha Gore and Jasmine Lawrence of Decolonised Architecture. International architects with Dr. Timothy Onyenobi, Deba Salam, Aslina Bulmer, the Director of International at the RIBA, and Bing Sheng. And organisational and self-awareness with Professor Jeremy Till and Professor Indy Johar and Baroness Doreen Lawrence. Whew, it's a packed one. And all of that is after...
Shock stats.
And according to Deloitte, 80% of people say inclusion is an important factor when choosing a new employer. 71% of people value working for an organisation with inclusive leaders. And another report says 74% of global executives believe diversity and inclusion is crucial to the success of their organisations. However, only 24% of those global executives are aware of the definition of inclusion. And despite, again, according to Deloitte, diversity and inclusion being the #1 HR practice with the highest impact on business performance, it's often not prioritised.
You're listening to Reba Radio, real inclusive, brilliant action with Marsha Ramroop.
Now, Marvin Rees is the City Mayor of Bristol. And he's an honorary fellow of the RIBA too, and he's been very outspoken about the design of cities, and it made sense to speak to him about inclusion in architecture. So I asked him, why is inclusive design important to him?
Well, I think there's obviously a moral importance to it. It's about how do you build just, fair societies, and many of us would say that's what we're actually about. But there's also a political and economic importance to it as well. unequal societies are less resilient. We've seen this through COVID. That lack of resilience can flow its way through in health inequalities that end up costing us lots of money because we end up treating acute illnesses. They can lead to political instability, which costs us money. Now, wherever you stand on Brexit, it's going to cost us a lot of money, and some of that's because people have not been served by the political economic order. And also they can lead to economic slowdowns as a consequence of all those instabilities. So there's an enlightened self-interest, even if we don't do it for moral reasons. And I think physical inclusion is absolutely mirrored and partnered by economic, social, political inclusion.
When you talk about inclusive design from an economic perspective, do you think that this is the driving force to actually bringing about change? How much do we really need to also talk about the moral imperative?
Well, we need to talk about the moral imperative, but I don't like getting stuck on the moral imperative because we're not here but begging people, asking them to do nice things. What we're saying is if people are in charge of sectors of our society do not know how to build resilience into those sectors, then actually they're building a vulnerable society. We would never really allow any of our managers to say, I'm going to build fragility into our banking system, would they? Or I'm going to build fragility into our education system. We wouldn't allow that. So the moral imperative, yes, but we're also focusing on the political economic importance. And the way places are built, the way places are designed are amongst the biggest determinants of life chances and inequalities and those levels of resilience.
So what does inclusive design look like for you? When you have the architecture in the built environment listening to you, what do you want them to be thinking about?
So I wouldn't say it looks like any particular type of building, but it looks like spaces where we see different types of people from different types of background, that we build spaces in which people are able to live in those spaces and be there like they own them, not be there like guests. I still feel like a guest in some parts of the city, and I'm the mayor of the city, but I still make those micro calculations every day when I go somewhere as to whether this is for me or not for me.
When you see the texture, if you like, of the city change as you move through it, what is it about the spaces that are inclusive compared with those that feel exclusive to you? What's the difference between them?
To be honest, I'm not even sure if it's about the physical spaces. It's about the affordability. So take a place like St. Paul's, right? So when I was a kid, St. Paul's, the place of two rebellions in the 80s and all the other headlines that goes on with it, is currently in the process of being gentrified. So whereas once it was felt to be a no-go zone, it's now seen as cool, and kind of the older communities that were there are disappearing. They're kind of almost evaporating. Now, the physical layout of the place hasn't changed. What's begun to change is the house prices.
And so what part can architecture and the built environment play in affordability?
Well, we need the breakthroughs, don't we, on how we get a decent share of affordability for mixed communities. In Bristol, we've said that we're not looking for developments that are 100% affordable. That creates a ghetto of affordability. What we want are mixed tenures, all mixed up, So what we need is people who come up with those solutions. How do we come up with designs when we're doing the new builds that actually offer those mix of tenures, so that we can get a good share of affordable within our developments? The challenge of urban designers is in looking at the old city, is in how they begin to grab hold of the economic model that surrounds physical spaces, because physical spaces don't just mean what they're designed to mean. There are lots of things that determine what they mean, but in part they are the product of the interaction between those physical spaces and inequality, the economy. So anyone who's serious about planning cities and spaces has to have in mind not just what nice buildings look like, because to be perfectly frank, I find some of those conversations, the preserve of, if I'm perfectly frank, even in Bristol, some old guy sitting around, see a young black guy and think, oh, he's not very stylish, is he? He doesn't know culture like we do. So I'm not, those conversations, I'm interested in people who are also thinking about how do we grab a hold of the economy and some of those wider inequalities that give meaning to the physical things that we build, whether we want those things to have that meaning or not. But look, let's be frank about it. You know, as a profession, it's not an inclusive profession, is it? Right? And I bump into this, and actually, the profession does need to get on top of that. So some of the pushback I've had is basically people saying, "Oh, Marvin," someone wrote an article saying, you know, basically it was quite a racist and a snobbish article saying I was dazzled by the bright lights of London and Manchester and I want to plaster skyscrapers all over the city. That's not what we're trying to do. What we're doing is we're saying we're 42 square miles, 460,000 people, growing to 550,000 by the middle of this century. We have 15,000 people on the housing waiting list, over 1,000 families in temporary accommodation, 1 in 4 children living in poverty, and we're a city that's you know, sits at racial fractures. We need to solve our housing crisis. We need more density, and we don't want to sprawl and build in a really chaotic, inefficient way. We need the profession to actually come with that, because too often the voice from the profession has been, these are the kind of buildings we like, don't build tall buildings. Well, great. Well, what are you going to say then to the you know, the family I meet that's got 3 kids in a 1-bed-sit temporary accommodation? To be credible, the profession needs to join the whole conversation about the complexity of social challenges we face. When we find that common ground, that we're all respecting the sheer range of challenges we're trying to take on in planning our city's futures, then we can have a really productive conversation. But I think so part of that can be taken on by the profession becoming more diverse, having people in it who've come from backgrounds when they've lived in a refuge and know what housing insecurity is, rather than just going to, you know, nice schools, nice universities, and then, you know, have an appreciation for fine buildings around the world. And I'm not saying everyone's in there. I'm being quite blunt in my description, but it can feel like that when you're on the receiving end of the lobby of, you know, guys in corduroy trousers and
black polo necks.
You don't care about the way the city looks. I do, but I also care about where the people have got a roof over their heads, you know.
So for you, success around inclusive design is that happy medium between, you know, something that looks good, isn't imposing on the city, but provides the housing that it needs.
How do we respect the city, you know, and its aesthetic appeal? Get that, matter of taste and all that. But how do we meet the needs of people today? You know, it was only. How do we make sure people got access to good quality homes as a base for a good quality life, a good trajectory in life? All those things need to be dealt with at the same time. And I think we're in an age now where no one really who takes themselves seriously should. No one. I don't think many would. Nobody takes them seriously would be single issue. Like all I am is about physical layout and expect the physical layout to work like that, because you have to take account of the social. You have to take account of history. You know, when you design something, if you design the right thing in the wrong place, in the wrong cultural context, the product of that interaction will not be what you meant it to be. And we've had a history that's full of that. So having that fullness of appreciation, that multiple worldview, that diverse worldview available at your fingertips, I think is going to be absolutely essential. You know, at the moment, we're trying to deliver decarbonisation, the recovery of nature, and an inclusive economic recovery. The three cannot be separated with a growing world population. That's our challenge right now.
So for you, if you had one message really for the architecture, just one, for the architecture and built environment sector around inclusive design, what would that one message be?
Well, first of all, I would probably issue a hasty apology for my corduroy trousers joke.
But I'm also putting them in black polo necks, so here we go. That's
right,
that's the stereotype.
My point would be, you know, let's please reach out and work with people, and let's talk about complexity. And I think it's one of the most important professions in the world right now. Good urbanization will mean that we potentially, cities have the ability to host a growing world population. You know, we're going to be at 10 billion over the coming decades. We have to find a way of the planet hosting those people in a healthy way, socially, politically, economically, environmentally. And so I think that the whole world of architecture and urban planning are amongst the most important professions that we have. But that means that it absolutely has to understand the raw material it is working with, not just the materials and forces that hold buildings up or have them fall down and what they look like, but how it interacts with existing inequalities, the global climate-driven migration crisis that is looming upon us, climate change and all the rest of it. So draw on that diversity of thought and worldview into the profession.
Lots of interesting points from Marvin Rees there about what inclusive design is for him as a city leader. And we'll talk about all of that in a second with our panel. But I was just wondering, we were both being very tongue-in-cheek about the stereotypical architects' outfits. And in fact, I was told after presenting to RIBA Council in April that I wore black, which always goes down well with architects. So I want to find out now. Architecture, are you wearing black? Are you wearing a black polo neck in particular? Are you wearing corduroy? Patty?
Yeah?
Yeah, Patty, can we do a Twitter poll?
Yeah.
Yeah, and ask. Let's ask Twitter. Let's ask architecture. Hashtag architecture on Twitter. Hashtag RIBA Radio. Look it up. Let's ask what people are wearing. Respond sort of like, are you wearing black? Yes or no? And let's see what we get. We're getting very daring. Very daring in these our final days. Our team here have been given control of the RIBA main Twitter account, and yes, dangerous stuff. To talk about inclusive design and some of the things Marvin was saying there, I have an excellent panel of Julie Fleck, Zoe Partington and Ian McKinnon. I'll get them to introduce themselves in a moment, but first let me just check out what they're wearing. And to be fair, none of them are architects, but you are inclusive design. They're all very colourful, very colourful. Julie, you literally wrote the book on this, so let's start with you. Who is Julie Fleck, and what does inclusive design mean to you?
Hi, and thank you very much for inviting me along this morning. I'm so glad I put on a really colourful top this morning, actually.
To show how non-architect you are.
I love lots of colour. So I trained as a town planner, in fact, but soon specialised in access, what it was then called 30 years ago, Access for Disabled People. And I've specialised in inclusive design, but with a very strong emphasis on making the world more accessible for disabled people and older people, and the people that we tend to forget when we design. And that's what my book is all about, is, are you an inclusive designer? Do you really have the right approach and attitude to really think about the diverse and huge difference that we all have in our lives? We all are very, very different from each other. And for me, inclusive design is very much about putting people first, making sure we're designing for everybody, for people, and really thinking about the diversity in our communities. And that's what I've been trying to do. I worked for the Corporation of London for about 15 years, putting physical access improvements around the square mile in the City of London. And although I've left, I'm basically retired now, having just written my book, but I was so pleased to see St Paul's Cathedral, one of the most iconic buildings in the whole country, have their north transept entrance has now been made accessible with the design of two substantial but very elegant ramps. So really major changes we've seen in the last 30 years. I then moved to the Greater London Authority, and I was their inclusive design manager, responsible for policies in the London Plan. So really pushing forward, and we've just heard about the difficulties with housing. One of the key things I think we've still not got right is how we design new homes and how we are dealing with existing buildings. So despite being pushing for better designs and better implementation, better action for 30 years, we've still got an awful long way to go. That hasn't said very much about me, actually, but I hope that's a good start.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Julie. Zoe, if I can ask you, who is Zoe Partington and what does inclusive design mean to you?
Right. Yeah, thank you for inviting me, and lovely to meet everybody. Can you hear me okay, Marsha? Is that okay?
Loud and clear, thank you.
Oh, that's good. Right. Well, I obviously I'm Zoe Partington, and I work with Joss Boyce. We co-direct something called Disordinary Architecture, and we've been doing that for about 10, 15 years probably. But prior to that, I very early on, I think I lost my sight when I was studying philosophy, architecture and visual art, and I found it quite a journey to understand the visual world because I'd lost my sight. And I very quickly, because of that, got involved with Scope. And then I was taken on as a trainee for the Royal National Institute for Blind People. And because I was interested in art and culture and architecture anyway, particularly the history of architecture, I started to work with somebody called Peter Barker at something called the Joint Mobility Unit in London at RNIB. This is going back sort of 25 years ago now, probably 30. And Peter was absolutely brilliant because he understood, as he was blind and had a sort of civil engineering background, that document part M was completely useless for things like sensory access and the development of designs and buildings, urban spaces, and it needed reviewing and it needed looking at, and dialogue needed to happen. And I thought that was just really exciting, really interesting, because I was very aware of it myself. But also what I noticed, and this was when I was working with Joss Boyce, I took Joss into the Reba bookshop actually, and this was probably 10, 15 years ago maybe. And I just said, right, try and find me something exciting on inclusive architecture in this bookshop. And obviously she spent an awful long time trying to locate a publication like that. And there wasn't anything. It was either about health or it was written by an access auditor. I mean, they were useful in some ways, technical guidance, but there was nothing exciting, nothing that was creative, nothing that was vibrant, nothing that had these joint voices between disabled people who were creative professionals and architects. And so that's where I started, really.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Zoe. And Ian, if I can ask you, who is Ian McKinnon and what does inclusive design mean to you?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's nice to hear Peter Barker's name come up, because I worked with Peter as well. I know Julie did, so that's really nice, actually. I mean, you know, I am currently Director of Inclusive Design for an organisation called the Global Disability Innovation Hub, or GDI Hub for short, because it's a bit of a mouthful. And that's ultimately kind of born out of the Paralympic Legacy programme from London 2012 in East London on the Olympic Park over in Stratford in East London. So we're a research, practice and teaching centre with lots of partners involved and doing a huge amount of interesting work, which I could talk for hours about, but I'll spare you that right now. But yeah, so I do that. I was the access and inclusive design lead for the Olympic Park post 2012. So for all the development that took place on and around the park in Stratford post 2012, I was the inclusive design champion for that. So, you know, that role involved writing and updating the inclusive design standards, facilitating the built environment access panel, of which Peter Barker was part of that. And yeah, it was a tremendous experience, and we're now hopefully kind of sharing that knowledge and learning and experience in the work that we now do, mostly internationally, particularly in developing countries.
Thanks. And so, you know, we do have the heavyweights, if you like, of inclusive design with us this morning. And I was reading a really, really great article in the Architects Journal before I started this role, actually, Is Disability Architecture's Final Taboo? And I reached out to the 4 architects with a disability featured in that article, one of them, which is Ben Stevens, a deaf architect. And he said, ideally, there needs to be 2 metre spacing between people for effective lip reading. And it's the same for sign language. So we need wider corridors, also the right wall colours. It's hard to read the hands of a person if the wall colour is similar to that of a skin tone. And he said another problem is right angled corners. Someone could walk into another person coming the other way, as a deaf person can't hear footsteps. So ideally corners should be curved or chamfered. In your opinion, if I can start with you, Julie, are architects thinking enough about this stuff?
I think it's really, it's very easy to blame the architect, if you like, and to say, well, you should have designed it differently. And I think there's lots of reasons for that. One of the projects I did after the Olympic and Paralympic Games was to work on one of the government's legacy programs. And we tried to require all of the professional institutions to teach inclusive design at university and even at school and before, you know, so that all of the built environment professionals had a good understanding and a good grasp of inclusive design. I don't think there's enough good education around the whole issue of inclusion. And so, you know, and it's very difficult because there are so many things that we all need to know. We can't all be experts, but there are a lot of experts out there. And I think that's the other thing, that we need to embed inclusive design experts into the project team. And where you see really good inclusive design in buildings, it's usually because either the architects themselves have really embraced the whole issue and really understood it and have got the right attitude and have involved disabled people and older people and others with diverse and different perspectives and experiences to their own. And if you continue to just design in a very narrow way and just meet the building regulation, then you will not get it right. And I think that's your example of how deaf people will move around a building. One of the examples in my book is Frank Barnes School for Deaf Children. Beautifully designed building, very accessible. It was designed in conjunction with the children themselves and with their parents and with the teachers, etc., and with an inclusive design expert, Chris Harrowell, who's deaf himself and an architect. And actually what my message really is, don't just do the designs with the curved corners and the balustrades where you can see through so you can continue lip reading or doing a sign language interpretation as you're walking around the building with the right colours and the lighting and all of those techniques. They can be in every single building. It doesn't need to be in a specialist place where you're going to have a lot of deaf people. It can be absolutely everywhere. So I think it's learning and understanding that and then working with it. But it's also the client. You have to really work with the client. And I think there is, the business case, which we all heard from Marvin about the cost of things, and the business case is really important, because a building that is more accessible to a much broader, diverse range of users is going to be a much more successful building. And I don't think we've really grasped that value of an accessible building and an inclusive building yet. So there's still a lot of work to do there.
Well, we're talking inclusive design with Julie Fleck, Zoe Partington and Ian McKinnon. We're really going to delve into that shortly. Ian, you actually suggested to me that we play Ian Dury and the Blockheads Hit Me With Your Rhythm Stick. Would you like to share why you suggested this tune?
Well, first and foremost, it's a great song. I love it. It's one of my favourite songs. But also, thinking about, Zoe's talking about, be more creative, being exciting, being vibrant. I think that needs to be that's important. And when talking about inclusion and inclusive design, that it is and should be viewed as an area that's exciting and ripe for innovation and creativity, and as an area that can be vibrant. And what better way than to look at disabled artists, disabled musicians, and some of the amazing back catalogue there. And so I thought, let's play a bit of Ian Dury. But first and foremost, it's a wonderful rock and roll song.
Coming up in the next hour, you must stay tuned, because I have to say, I haven't made much of a secret of this. I'm very excited that we have Dr. Neil Chassor of the London School of Architecture and Professor Corinne Fowler of the University of Leicester, alongside Harsha Gore and Jasmine Lawrence of the student group Decolonise Architecture, speaking about that subject of decolonisation. It's caused a lot of division, criticism, that word, that idea. So I hope we can shed some light rather than on heat on that very necessary matter, which we must discuss in the profession. And if you missed it, aligned with that is the Angela Saini interview about race. You'll be able to see that on the RIBA YouTube channel, and it'll be there until Christmas, so do check that out. Right now, though, another necessary conversation, inclusive design, with Julie Fleck, Zoe Partington and Ian McKinnon. And before we went to that excellent rock and roll track, as you say, Ian, there, we were talking about, or Julie was saying about how you need to involve other voices in design. Zoe, what were your reflections on that?
Totally agree. But one of the issues that we have is that disability culture and disability heritage isn't taught in schools, nor in art schools, nor in the architecture schools. And also disabled people haven't been present necessarily in schools, so they've been segregated to other schools. So those voices are still not there in many ways. It's changing, it's getting better, but we've really got to shift that. We've really got to change that. And I think, I mean, it's very, very obvious when I'm working with people, and I can recognise immediately through the language, the conversations, the dialogue, the type of art and culture that they're watching, whether they have any idea about the disabled community and insights from disabled people. And one of the other issues is, if we are including disabled people within these establishments and institutions, it needs to be across everything. So we need to see role models, we need to see architecture tutors, that are disabled people or deaf people or neurodivergent. It needs to be not hidden away, I think, because people are still quite reticent about being singled out or about, you know, being isolated. Or and the other thing, as experts, I mean, I found this, that sometimes as a disabled person, I want to curate an exhibition. Things like functional access or the space and the environment, it should automatically be accessible. I find it very strange that, you know, after guidance and technical information has been there for the last 30 or 40 years, we're still repeating those things. And actually, I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in, you know, disability art and disability culture being embedded within what we're doing, so that we are creating better spaces, better environments, using better materials, thinking about acoustics, for deaf people or all sorts of people with sensory access issues and older people. And it's just, you know, it's making it part and parcel of every day, so that those conversations are there. And the other issue is, because disabled people aren't present in our architecture schools as much as they should be, we've still got that missing link. So those conversations of natural dialogue are not happening. It's always a little bit, you know, read this report or go and look at something online, and then we'll all come back and talk about sensory access. And there's still huge gaps in it, because people are missing the finite detail, which actually is really important.
Yeah, and here on Reba Radio, we've really recognised the sort of absence and the relative quietness of the disability voice, really trying to amplify that. And we're going to have Amy Francis Smith on tomorrow as well. But Ian, if I can ask you, in the world of design, those thinking about inclusiveness generally do jump straight to considering accessibility. You know, things like colour palettes and guidelines and so on. And I wonder really, in today's day and age, whether gender, cultural identity can be ignored when it comes to inclusive design, because people are thinking more about accessibility rather than inclusiveness in a more overarching sense.
Yeah, there is an issue at times with silos, I would say, you know, and with picking it up one kind of topic at a time. And you have, at the moment, you may have certain experts, so-called experts on design teams that will come in, and they have responsibility for a, you know, section of it, you know, and if you're lucky, you'll have an access consultant, as was, or an inclusive design consultant come in and look at disability inclusion, and you would hope that issues around gender and faith and things would be picked up as part of that. But it can feel a little bit siloed at times, and I suppose a reflection back to kind of what's been said about education being so important, that is massively important. I think for me, I always view it a little bit as there's a kind of short-term view and goal, and then a longer-term one. I think the longer-term one for me does sit squarely with education, to ensure that people, key decision makers, and that includes your designers, have that grounding, you know, as Zoe says, in disability culture and heritage, but also in good inclusive design practice, you know. And for the latter part, in terms of good inclusive design practice, that's something that we are trying to do. We've got launched a new master's course awarded by University College London, UCL, which is a master's course called Disability Design and Innovation, within which is an optional module that I teach, which is on inclusive design and environments, and that's in its third year, and it's our way of beginning to kind of build on what does exist, which is very, very little in terms of good kind of quality inclusive design education for designers, for architects, for planners. And really, I think that any design discipline, and all design disciplines, including architecture, you know, undergraduate studies, year one, you should be getting a core module course on inclusive design, and then it should be ingrained. The foundation is there, and whether that's your passion or not, you know, people get into design for different reasons. At least that foundation is there, and so eventually, when they come to make these key decisions, they have that awareness, and that's, at the moment, that is sorely lacking.
Yeah, and Julie, you're quite sort of, you know, passionate. You mentioned a little bit earlier about how it does start with the education piece.
Absolutely. You know, one of the messages in my book is, as Zoe said, we've been trying to get this right for the last 50 or 60 years. Actually, you can go right back to the 1950s when people started to look at why our buildings were inaccessible and why people were being excluded, not because of their health, their impairment or their particular circumstances, but because of the way we design. And actually through my career over the last 30 odd years, you know, I started off as access officer for disabled people. It was very much about special provision for disabled people. And then gradually through the 1990s, it's changed to inclusive design. And actually we don't want separate or special provision. We want it to be absolutely inclusive right from the very beginning, so that whatever your particular preference or needs or circumstances are, you can move, you can arrive at a building and move through a building in exactly the same way as everybody else. And that was one of the things that we really tried for in the London 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games, was that everybody had an accessible experience. And it is about the experience that people get. And if you haven't had that knowledge and understanding, and you don't have that right attitude, it is really about attitude and knowledge and skills, which only starts at university when you're starting your architectural planning or surveying course. If you don't really get it, then when you come to do your designs, you will make compromises. And if you compromise, you will exclude. And if you exclude, you discriminate. And that should be illegal. It's been illegal since 1995. And I think there's problems with our equality legislation that needs changing as well. I get so frustrated just walking around South London where I live. There are new cafes being refurbished in buildings that still don't have accessible toilets. There's an office block that's just been turned into a block of flats, and it's got 3 stairs up to the front door. Well, that should not happen in 2021. It should be absolutely basic access stuff that's been in the building regulations since 1987. Why do we not get it right? You know, we don't provide that respect and that dignity to all of our community, and that comes down to our attitude and our understanding and our knowledge and skills. And if we don't get those knowledge, skills, attitudes embedded, as Ian was saying, right at that very beginning, and the best way to do that is to involve a diverse group of people in your design team when you're consulting as well. So I've always worked with an access group, but that's very much, you know, a sort of it's lip service, really. It doesn't really change. What really needs to change is those people with the power, with the money, who are commissioning buildings at the very beginning, whether that's the government turning an old job centre into a block of flats, or a developer building 500 new homes. It should be with the developer at the very beginning, who should be requiring inclusive design right from day one, right from, you know, stage 0.
So Zoe, I mean, you know, those things that Julie talking about there, very much, you know, embedding these ideas and the culture into the education of architecture in the built environment. That's going to be a few, even if we started that tomorrow, which I really hope we would. It's going to be a few years for that to filter into the real world. So what would you say architecture and the built environment need to do today? You know, they get a commission, they get a project, it's landing on their desk tomorrow morning. What do they need to do to make sure that that is as inclusive as it could possibly be?
Are you asking me, Marcia?
Yes, Zoe, thanks.
Yeah. Well, the first thing, you can have a look at the Disordinary Architecture website and look at all the millions of resources and books and things that people can read to very quickly find out how disabled people want spaces and environments to be designed, and deaf people. You can also bring disabled people that understand architectural language. I think that's also important, onto those teams to work with people. And I think getting a cross-section is really useful, because it doesn't mean one disabled person understands every other disabled person's perspectives. Some people do, because they've been working in that field a very long time. So it's really about asking the right people to support you and to help you in the project that you're about to start or be involved with. There's lots of information online as well, lots of talks that people do around this area. So I don't think it's not impossible anymore, because we've got such amazing access to the internet and to the web.
And Ian, you know, your view on, you know, what people could be doing. There's no shortage of information available.
There's, Julie's book, Are You an Inclusive Designer? Amongst other materials, that Zoe mentioned there, her website as well. What do you want those architects and built environment contractors and those to be thinking about right now as they look at their new projects?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's quite a difficult question, really, but I would hope that they are just being able to kind of rise above the detail of the day-to-day jobs to think a little bit more about the bigger picture, about what they're actually trying to do with the project, what they're actually trying to provide. What is this that we're building? If it's a housing development, if it's a public building, who's going to use this on a daily basis? Who are we building this for? And then make sure that you go and you speak to those people. And when you speak to the local communities, the local people who will be engaging with that place or space, whatever it is, on a daily basis, make sure you speak to a wide range across the demographic of the local community that's going to use that space, and just make sure your engagement is genuine and real. That, as I said before, that was part of my role in the Olympic Park, was to facilitate those conversations between design teams coming in and local disabled people who lived around the park, who had a vested interest, who were going to use these places every day once they were built. And in those conversations, almost every time was where little gems would fall out, little nuggets would fall out that would make demonstrable change to the design that was in its benefit for everyone, and that the design team would always look back on and think, yeah, of course, that makes perfect sense to me now, but I had no idea. It's not through malice, it's usually through ignorance that we find ourselves in positions where designs are done and buildings are built that are not fit for purpose. So I would ask them to have open minds, to do genuine engagement with a cross-section of the demographic that's going to use the project that they're building. Really listen to them, take it on board, and use that as a fuel, as a catalyst to innovate and to design the best design they can. And I guarantee you it will go on to win awards, and it will be more sustainable in the long run, because it will require less adaptation or future changes down the line. And every time.
Ian, that awards are a particular driver, but to pick up on a point that Julie made earlier, the economics, the money, there is a perception that doing things well, inclusively, requires more cash. Is that for real? Is that a real perception? And also, is there a sense that people want to try to, especially those in building and construction, might try to make those compromises in order to maximise their profit?
Yeah, we often get asked for the economic argument for this, and there is a strong economic argument. There's reports that I'm going to forget the reference, but after this we can direct you to it. But essentially, some good stats are, in terms of it shouldn't necessarily increase your overall budget, but you do need to allocate budget to this. You need to have resource to make sure that good inclusive design is being done, and you may need to have some specific facilities that may have cost, but it should not increase your overall budget. You just need to allocate that budget, and if you do it at the start of the project, then the impact would be less. And good stats on this: there was research done by the RCA years and years ago that says for any design project, to make those changes and to embed inclusive design early would say cost like 1 times like the amount, like say times 1. To do it post completion will cost you 10,000 times more. And you will have to make those retrofits. If you build something that's not fit for purpose, you will have to go back and retrofit, and it will cost you 10,000 times more. Also, the World Health Organization has a stat from research it's done saying that, again, if you embed inclusive design at the start of your project, then it could cost up to 1% of your overall budget. So again, if you factor that in, it's only 1%, roughly, of your overall budget. To then try and factor that in further down the line, beyond detailed design, once you begin construction, it will cost you anywhere up to 20% of your budget. So do it early, it will cost you less, and you will reap the rewards, because as we've shown, there are economic benefits in as much that, again, if it's a public building, you're opening it up to a much wider market, much wider audience. It'll be more sustainable. You won't have to retrofit, so it can be open for longer because it's fit for purpose. So there is an economic argument that's there. It's sometimes just a little bit hard to find.
Zoe, do you come across this, quite a lot, this people having this perception that it's going to cost them more to try to be more inclusive?
Sorry, can you say that again, Marsha, or type it in the book?
Zoe, do you find you come across this quite a lot, that people are more likely to have this perception that it's going to cost more to be inclusive?
I missed the last bit, but if it's around budget, I think budgets are used as a barrier. So it links into medicalising the analysis of how a disabled person, how we might change the environment for a disabled person. And one of the issues for me around the budget and the cost implications, disabled people constantly have to fill out forms to justify being a disabled person and then be given money to fix things that are in our environment and spaces that are inaccessible to us. So it's a very odd concept that we have in place. And when we look at the budgets, if you work with disabled people that are knowledgeable, you can reduce costs significantly because their idea of accessibility may cost a lot less than people that haven't necessarily understood the process of wayfinding or what does mean or what would make good access. So it also comes to evaluation. It's evaluating these things that are put in place and looking at the evaluation of it. And I just think that, we still, institutional discrimination is really quite rife. And I think until we shift that, until we start to get people to think differently about where the problem lies, it's going to be quite hard to shift thinking. And obviously good examples shift thinking, and that's great, the more that we can get those into spaces and environments. And like Julie was saying, buildings and cafes and restaurants, museums and galleries, they're still going up and they're still inaccessible. And it's surprising because if you were in an architecture school, you wouldn't ask someone to design, well, you might to get them to think differently, but you wouldn't sort of think about, let's design a space where we're going to exclude people. How would we do this? So I don't think anybody starts from that, but actually, if you don't understand what's missing because you don't know what you don't know because you haven't asked, you will immediately put barriers in place into the building and the urban spaces you're designing, and even the gardens and parklands.
And Julie, if I can give you the final word, this is an opportunity to really change our spaces so that we can create an inclusive society. So that there's a real message of hope that we can give to architects and the built environment if they were to take on board what you've been saying.
Just quickly before I answer that, one really good example was during the 2012 when London was trying to improve the visitor experience. Transport for London installed ramps at the on certain platforms so that people could get on and off a tube without having to step down. And of course, what they found is not only did that make it easier for wheelchair users and people with prams and pushchairs, but actually everybody gets on and off the train much quicker. So if all of our station platforms were level with the train, the whole transport system would be transformed and the whole shift of passengers, etc., would be speeded up and it would be far more efficient. So we tend to concentrate on the wheelchair user who we possibly never see, but actually if you make it accessible, it will benefit absolutely everybody. And I think the most important thing for me is that people think about the people, as Ian was saying, as Zoe was saying, think about the people, but it's about providing choice. We worked out the principles of inclusive design 20 years ago, and it is about putting people at the heart of the design process. It's about providing choice. A single solution does not work for everybody. A ramp into a building does not work for everybody. People want steps, they want escalators, they want lifts. We want choice, and it needs to be there up front. I don't want to walk in and see a flight of stairs and signs to a lift at the back of the building. The lift should be beside the staircase, absolutely integrated. I don't want to see a revolving door and a side door that's always locked. I want to see automatic doors that we can all just walk through and enjoy, wheel through, whatever, with our guide dog sign language. absolute equality of experience. It's providing dignity and respect for everyone.
Broadcasting your inclusion journey online, 18th to the 26th of November. You're listening to Reba Radio.
You are listening to Reba Radio, broadcasting live from the bookshop at 66 Portland Place. I'm Marsha Ramrib. I'm the Director of Inclusion here. And we are 21 hours down, unbelievably. I don't know how we got to this stage. 21 hours down, which means there's only 7 hours to go. We're racing through it, absolutely racing through it. 28 hours of material to help you build inclusion into everything you do. It's all rooted in that foundational behavioural principle of CQ, cultural intelligence. We've spoken about inclusive design. Now we're talking decolonising architecture. That we're going to talk international architects and organisational and self-awareness and impact. We're talking more CQ strategy. It's day 6, the penultimate day of Reba Radio.
Reba Radio with Marsha Ramrib.
You are listening to Reba Radio, broadcasting live from the bookshop at 66 Portland Place, where you can hear the atmosphere, people moving around, they're working, browsing the bookshop. You can hear the reception as well. All of that here at the HQ, the Royal Institute of British Architects. We're all about CQ, cultural intelligence, and the cultural intelligence is the capability to work and relate effectively with those from different backgrounds. Coming up today, it's our second of 2 days talking CQ strategy, which is thinking about what you're thinking about, planning interactions, checking our assumptions. Self-awareness is all about creating procedural changes to mitigate the impact of hidden bias, and that means talking decolonisation with Dr. Neil Chassor, Professor Corinne Fowler, Harsha Gore and Jasmine Lawrence of the Decolonised Architecture Group. And all of that is coming up after today's
Dish of the day.
Hi, my name is Maxine McKenzie and I am Executive Director for Marketing and Membership Development at Reba. So my chosen dish of the day is brown stew chicken. It's a very traditional Jamaican dish, usually eaten on Sundays with rice and peas and lots of other delicious accompaniments. It's very special to me because my dad was Jamaican and my mum is English, and it was my dad that taught my mum to cook. So she kind of looks like Mary Berry but cooks like Levi Roots, and this is her very special version. I think every family has their own version of this dish, and this is the one that she's passed on to me and our family. So I hope you give it a try and I hope you enjoy it.
Thanks very much, Maxine. Now, the idea of decolonisation in architecture and indeed elsewhere in society has made some people very anxious. Noises have been made about histories being rewritten, the past being erased and other things too. And to talk about this and to make clear what decolonising is, we have Dr. Neil Chassor. He's an architecture historian, also writing a book for the Reba on this. Professor Corinne Fowler, Director of Colonial Countryside and National Trust Houses Reinterpreted, and students Harsha Gore and Jasmine Lawrence from the Decolonised Architecture Group. But before we hear from them, I'd like to play a clip from the conversation that I had with Angela Saini, the science journalist and author of Superior, The Return of Race Science. And I asked her what her take on decolonisation was.
It's become a very fraught phrase, decolonisation, and sometimes I hesitate in using it because it automatically switches some people off. Really, all it is giving more context, historical context to ideas that we already have. Now, and this is true globally, when you go to any museum, national museum, it presents a vision of that state in the most positive light. That is normal. That is true if you go to a museum in Egypt or India or China or wherever it is in the world. That's normal to do that. The problem with these kind of nationalistic versions of history, which every country employs, is that they leave out so much. And it's very difficult in a social media age, in an internet age, to maintain those fictions. because people just go online and they know that Britain was involved in the slave trade, that the empire was terrible, that it committed so many wrongs and led to the deaths of so many people, that it was not welcomed in the way that some people have hoped that we could, characterize it that way. So when we have these counter histories, and then we see these nationalistic histories in museums or in the official history books, there's a dissonance, and people want those full histories. They want to understand, not only because they want the facts, but also because in a multicultural country like the UK, where you have people who have been part of those histories. My grandfather fought in the Second World War for the British. My great-grandfather fought in the First World War for the British. Empire and colonialism is a part of my personal family history. I want that reflected in British history because they were also part of British history. And to not see that reflected, then obviously you feel left out, and it's only fair that they should be. That is all decolonization is. It's not really anything more than that. It's just about giving all that extra context. I've worked with a few museums over the last year or two on this topic, and I've seen firsthand how difficult it is within institutions to confront this, because they serve so many different masters, not just the public who are demanding this. There's also a section of the public that are demanding that we don't do anything. There's also the staff who very often demand that we do something. And then there's the government who demands that we don't do anything. So you have all these different voices who want a stake in this narrative. What does it mean to be British? What does the history of Britain mean? And how are we going to tell that story? That is a fundamental question. And it's a question that all countries around the world are facing, including here in the US. And I think if we are going to build a notion of Britishness that is truly inclusive, that is fair and tolerant, and not just tolerant, but welcoming, that really celebrates what Britain is now, then we have to expand those histories, and we can't be nationalistic or jingoistic about it. We have to do it in an honest way, not least because if you don't do it in an honest way, people can just go online and find out for themselves. And then they feel they're being lied to if you don't get that honest history. Whatever statues you choose to leave up, people can just go online and learn for themselves the true history. You're not fooling anyone.
Well, Professor Corinne Fowler, Director of Colonial Countryside, do you agree with Angela?
Yes, I completely agree with everything she said. I think there's an issue when you mix up historical evidence with national pride, and when you see history through a lens of guilt, shame or celebration, you're always going to leave stuff out, and it's always going to be a very partial, selective history. So, I mean, basically, I can't ever see how there can be anything wrong with more information than less information. Why that would be preferable is a bit of a mystery, but it's also about giving that fuller history. And the reason that people are often resistant to hearing about that history is because it's unfamiliar. It's not something that people really learned at school, even though there are 400 years or so of British colonial history. It's not something which a lot of people know very much about. So there's a bit of a knowledge gap, which is what partly triggers people when we try to talk about that fuller history and have a more, perhaps fuller disclosure, really.
Harsha, you are part of this group, Decolonise Architecture. Can you tell me a little bit about the group and what you're trying to do with the architecture curricula in universities?
Yes, of course. What we have been working towards is creating a format of education that is more holistic, it's free for all, and it's trying to be more inclusive in the way that architecture is taught to us students. So that means expanding the history curriculum that we learn, since it often does not include notions of colonial histories, or it does not necessarily paint a picture of the wider architectural context. So what we are working on is a student-led initiative to try and broaden the horizons that we see in architecture schools so that we graduate as more well-rounded architects by the end of it.
And Jasmine, you're also part of this Decolonise Architecture group. What has been your experience of learning about architecture and architecture history that felt like there was something lacking, there's something missing?
I think the main thing for us, which we picked up during our undergraduate education, was the Eurocentric nature of the history and theory course. And this is something which I think is widespread at universities across the UK. And so there's this real focus on Western architecture, and particularly what are known as Starchitects like Corbusier, and not so much, very little mention to global architecture or those which are non-Western. Even when we had learned a little bit about more world architecture, it was often in vernacular forms or demonstrated or taught to us as something which was primitive even, which wasn't necessarily correct or an accurate view.
Neil, you wear a number of hats. You're CEO of the London School of Architecture. You're also an architecture historian. So when you are considering decolonisation, what does that mean for the profession from your perspective?
Well, it's a slightly difficult question. I mean, if I can go back to the clip and this idea that decolonizing is just about giving more context or just extra context, I think were the phrases used. I would sort of treat that cautiously. I think that's important, yes, but I'm not entirely sure that's what decolonizing, or indeed decoloniality, decolonial praxis is actually asking us to do. And I wouldn't want to sell it short in a way, because I think giving extra context in museums and public institutions, great, totally for that. More inclusive, more diverse, absolutely. That's not quite what decoloniality is asking us to do. Decoloniality is really trying to get at how our whole knowledge system, right, what we might call our epistemes, is rooted in coloniality. And coloniality is something that is distinct from the political, physical, geographical act of colonizing, of colonization, of colonialism. It's as much a mindset and a descriptor for a set of social, cultural, political, economic relations that can happen in advance of political colonization and indeed endure beyond political decolonization. And so what it is encouraging us to do is to respect the fact that there are other ways of understanding and being and knowing and living in the world, not just Western European ones that grew out of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and indeed out of the project of modernity more generally. So that's what I think can be really exciting. And it is why decolonizing architecture, to an extent, if you sort of accept that rubric, is fundamentally paradoxical. Yeah, because architecture is absolutely born of that context, of that mindset, of that epistemic tradition.
Corinne, you're nodding away there. So you agree with both Angela and Neil in terms of, what we should be aiming to do around decolonising architecture?
Yeah, I mean, obviously my expertise isn't in the area of architecture, but it's right that it does go deeper than just more knowledge, fuller history. It's about rethinking education system, as was said, ways of knowing, other forms of knowledge in non-hierarchical ways, because this is always the problem that we often have, that it's a very deep way of rethinking everything and not and just being aware of our thought processes and the systems of knowledge which we've internalized as normal, natural, and the right way to be.
But it's not sort of fetishizing it's not primitivizing. I think it's a really important word that Jasmine has introduced to the conversation. Nor, again, sorry to take issue with your previous contributor, is it really, in my mind, about multiculturalism? It's actually about a wonderful, rich hybridity, right? So it's not about going back to pure forms of knowledge in West Africa or in Asia or in East Asia. It's not saying that we need to return to those quote unquote primitive ways of knowing or being. It accepts, yeah, this is a really important point that often gets missed in the public discussion. It accepts that coloniality and colonialism happened, and that we're in a very complicated, messy, hybrid world. And it just allows us, nonetheless, to bring into re-existence, which is a phrase that you read a lot in decolonial discourse, bring into re-existence ideas that were otherwise repressed through coloniality over the past X hundred years.
That's the problem, though, isn't it, Neil? That, you know, someone like Corinne, he's been very vocal, very visible in whatever the opposite of repressing is, like that reawakening of these realities. I mean, Corinne, you faced some real harsh, difficult, painful backlash. I mean, what's that been like? Just by opening up that conversation?
Well, all I did was co-authored a report with the National Trust about its country houses' connections to empire. I mean, I just to respond to the previous point, I wasn't saying any of the things that I think you thought I was saying, Neil. At all.
The clip, not you.
Oh, right. I wasn't saying anything about primitivism, just in case anyone thinks that. Yeah, I mean, it was pretty intense. It was simply releasing a report to open up the conversation about the history which was being missed out when people went to visit National Trust houses. And as you know, it's a very large organisation. It's got 5.7 million members. And the backlash from government ministers, from the 56 Common Sense Group MPs, from the newspapers, I mean, Twitter was relatively kind. It's just 6 months of horrible newspaper coverage with very little right of reply, and all the hate mail that then comes is a common experience, unfortunately, in the present moment for especially people of colour, but also women and academics who were working in this area.
Harsha, if I can ask, as you're in a university environment, by opening up this conversation, what kind of reaction have you had?
I'd first say we've been very lucky with the reception that we've gotten at some of the universities that we've managed to reach. I would like to actually maybe acknowledge the fact that, as Angela said in the clip that you played as well, the generation that I live in, we are so attuned to social media. We're always on the internet, that we're constantly learning, and I feel like our kind of the ages that we work with are quite absorptive in like the way that we kind of process information. So we've been very lucky that the reception that we've gotten has been very encouraging, very positive. And we've been able to really speak to people in our cohorts across universities about how our educational experiences have all shaped us into really wanting something more out of this. And we've been able to have quite free and open conversations with people our age, which has been very refreshing to have, actually.
Jasmine, I don't know if that was a disclaimer on Harsha's part to say having great conversations with people her age, but what about when you're approaching tutors, when you're approaching the institutions? Are they as open as your student peers?
I would say on the whole, so far, yes, although we have received a slightly mixed response in terms of some of the student staff forums we've held. But I think in terms of the kind of scale that we've experienced, it's been on one side, there are tutors which are really enthusiastic and positive about making their own steps towards change within the bounds of the curriculum, because of course there are restrictions in terms of following the accreditation requirements. So it's actually really quite encouraging to see kind of their own little changes and the ideas that they've come up with to get around certain aspects of the course that they felt needed improving. But I think on the other hand, sometimes there can be a little bit of defensiveness which comes along. But again, I think we've been quite fortunate because even when we have witnessed this later down the line, it seems that the same people have then started to understand the stance that we've been coming from, and again have really shown, I guess, growth and enthusiasm for wanting to kind of join that change.
So Neil, you know, listening to that conversation, do you think you might be too many steps ahead of where the profession and individuals and education might be in terms
I'm always too many steps
Of course you are. Should note as well that Neil's wearing a black polo neck. So, you know, really seriously though, I mean, you know, that kind of opportunity to really bring people back to some basics. You know, how do we do that?
It's difficult because people do, you know, they find this very scary, and it's actually very heartbreaking to hear Corinne's description of her experience for the amazing work that she's done on colonial countryside. I suppose, and perhaps naively, my way of thinking about it is that the whole idea of decolonial praxis seems to invite such creativity and such imagination that you just got to keep going with it. You know, it generates so many ideas and different ways of looking at and understanding the world. I mean, I smiled inwardly when Jasmine was talking about you know, the meeting the blocker of accreditation. You know, if only we had a platform, you know, in which a validating body might be listening to these questions. Yes, there is something also, I think, inherent in decoloniality, in particular when it meets something like architecture and something like the Royal Institute of British Architects, that it would involve to an extent Turkey's voting for Christmas, because if you really kind of want to take it to its kind of radical conclusion, it might mean that this particular form of practice and this particular discipline called architecture may not actually survive unscathed, right? It may not look exactly as it looks. I make the point also that this is only obliquely related to your question, but you know, the RIBA, as I've argued before, and I don't say this, you know, in an accusatory way, but as Corinne put it earlier, as incontrovertible evidence has it, was an imperial institute. Yeah, it sat at the nexus of an imperial system of architectural regulation and education. Has the RIBA ever sat down and reflected on how it might undo some of that, I guess, central pseudo-imperial control? Has it reflected about its international strategy, its international engagement strategy, about diversity, issues of diversity and inclusion? Of course, your appointment, Marsha, is part of that. But you know, that has taken a long time to happen since political decolonization, you know, beginning, I suppose, in earnest, really in the post-war period. Does that make sense?
It does, and we'll delve into it a bit more with architectural historian Dr. Neil Chassor, Professor Corinne Fowler, Director of Colonial Countryside, and students Harsha Gore and Jasmine Lawrence from Decolonised Architecture, after Alicia Keys and Superwoman.
You're listening to Reba Radio, real inclusive, brilliant action.
We've invited 7 special guests from the worlds of architecture, design, arts and culture to present a pre-recorded music hour broadcast between 5 and 6 p.m. each day. And our guest presenters will share personal stories, unique insights reflected by their choice of top tunes coming from all areas across the musical spectrum. And today, as he marks 100 days in his role, we have the president of the RIBA and director of AHMM, Simon Alford. You can listen to Simon recalling some personal stories, key music influences from Jane Birkin to Jimmy Cliff and the Sex Pistols. Earlier, we were speaking about inclusive design with Julie Fleck, Zoe Partington and Ian McKinnon. If you missed it, you can hear all of today's content repeated after we come off air at 1 o'clock. We're discussing decolonisation in architecture with architectural historian Dr. Neil Chassor, Professor Corinne Fowler, who's Director of Colonial Countryside, and students Harsha Gore and Jasmine Lawrence from the Decolonise Architecture Group. And Neil, just before we went to Alicia Keys, you were asking, well, you know, the RIBA, its very existence, it's an existential question to be considering decolonisation. And I think from my perspective, certainly just opening up this conversation is just got to be a good start to try to look at that word royal at the beginning of even the name of the organisation. And, you know, Corinne, this is very much when you're looking at institutions and deep stately history, for want of a better term, this is really what you've been looking at and trying to open up those conversations. It can be seen as a can of worms, of course, but, you know, opening up those conversations, how important is it to you?
It's critical, and I think quite often you have to start at a very basic level. So actually knowing what that colonial history is in the first place is a really good start. And it's incredible how little is known, even to the point where if you ask anybody in an organisation things like, what was the East India Company? What did it do? Who was ruling in India before the East India Company came along? You know, what was the British involvement in slavery and how did it make itself manifest? How long did it go on for? I mean, these things we need to actually know to start off with in the first place. And that's what we were trying to do with the National Trust, to actually do a desktop survey, which of course is always something which is useful starting place. Do a desktop survey of all the research findings so far on the colonial history of your own organisation is a very important starting point. But a lot of the history that comes out can be really quite fascinating, sort of nuanced, complex, and it's very unique. So, for example, I was the other day at a house called Sesinkot. I don't know if anyone's been there, but it was almost the start of a kind of Indian architectural style in Britain. And my colleague Raj Pal, who is an historian, went with his goddaughter, who is of Indian heritage, and she found it really inspiring and said she couldn't believe that she'd lived 50 minutes drive away in Birmingham from this amazing Mughal style palace in Cotswold stone. And she didn't know anything about it. She'd never been there before. And it made her feel not that she was ignoring the violence of colonial history, but that Indian connection been made manifest in the countryside, in the British countryside, in a way that made her feel curious and excited. But I think it's also understanding those material histories, isn't it? The history of copper, the history of ironworks, and how all of those things, those material histories, are connected to British colonial history also.
Jasmine, when you hear Corinne talk there about, you know, some of the depths of the history, so you start to dig and you start to peel back a layer, and then there's another layer, and then there's another. You know, can you cope with all of that whilst you're still trying to study architecture at the same time?
I must admit it can be quite overwhelming sometimes, you know, trying to make change in this field. But I think I guess sometimes it is just about managing it and trying to break it down. And I think especially for us, the kind of work that we do and our objectives are broken down in scale, I think, especially for this exact reason. So we try and obviously we have like an overarching game, and we would like to ultimately help to decolonize the curriculum, but we recognize that's a long-term goal and it's going to take a lot of work, a lot of years. It's very ambitious. And so, yeah, we try and break things down and think about, okay, what can we do right now, which will still work towards making an impact for that longer term goal, and ultimately help with the education, I think, which Corinne mentioned as well, about all of these histories, which are just, yeah, layers and layers deep. And I think that really kind of helps to not feel so helpless towards that overarching game.
Harsha, when I was asking a question to Jasmine, I noticed something about even the way that I phrased the question, in that, you have to peel back these layers whilst also studying architecture. And there's a sense that actually architecture in itself, even though it is integral to it, to be able to study it in a way that is really acknowledges all these things that you're trying to bring to the fore.
Absolutely. One of the things I kind of was thinking about as you were asking was just how we can try and bridge that gap between understanding about decolonization being quite this like academically focused objective that it currently is, and trying to take away from that notion that it has to be done in like this academic or theoretical setting, and making it more digestible and accessible to readers or anyone of any age. So one of the things, like Jasmine said, since we're kind of trying to work at smaller scales at a time, one of the things that we're also trying to do is just broaden the horizons of where we can learn about post-colonialism or decolonialism form. So it doesn't necessarily have to just be academic books. We're kind of looking at maybe pushing for, music or films or storybooks or books written for children. And just as long as we can try and find adjacent reflections to stories of decolonization or stories of migration, for example, it makes learning about this environment a lot easier and a lot more digestible. And then it's kind of then more possible to pick it up and scale it up, because you kind of understand the emotions that run behind it as well, which we think is kind of key to making this something that we can achieve somewhere down the line.
Neil, the other point that Corinne was making there was about this survey of colonial history of, like, say, for example, if it were of the RIBA, if we were to run that kind of thing across our 50,000 members, what sort of questions do you think would be useful to ask in terms of trying to just gauge a sense of, do you know the history, the colonial history of an organisation like the RIBA?
It's a difficult question. Well, that would be a good one to start with. I think it might also, well, look, Marsha, if I can answer the question slightly obliquely, because I think what Corinne said was really interesting, that we don't actually have, I think, an especially good account of how architecture was implicated in coloniality and in colonialism in the first instance. And I think that often the mistake that is made is that architectural history is viewed solely as a history of design. Design is part of this, but not all of it. So we need to understand how, for instance, in the 1880s and 1890s, in particular, the RIBA began to forge alliances with other colonial architectural institutions throughout the empire. We need to understand how this inflected the RIBA's kind of international engagement strategy, the kinds of discourses that created about development. We need to understand its material manifestations. As you know, I've discussed in particular about empire timbers, the use of empire timbers at 66 Portland Place, and there are other examples we could think of. And then the other thing that we have to resist, just to come back to design, which is my problem the sort of problem that I landed on earlier, which is it's not just about more context, because actually design, we could argue, has a lot to do with coloniality, because what it does, for instance, with vernacular or indigenous traditions, is translate them into design. But that whole process of translation into a framework called design, something that is taught in university, something that we do, something that we understand through texts and diagrams and plan and section and elevation, is arguably all part of coloniality. Yeah, it's trying to force a different knowledge system into a pre-existing hegemonic one. And that is precisely what decoloniality is asking us not to do, or to think differently about. So I'm not sure that helps with your questionnaire. I'm mulling that over. I mean, I think you'd want to know something about that, how people do engage with other kinds of knowledge about architecture and design, what their international links are. I did feel, I'm sure this isn't the case now, but that the RIBA's international strategy, 5 or 6 years ago, which was about expansion of the membership into India and into the Middle East, actually was done remarkably uncritically. I mean, of all the places to start.
And we're going to
Can I just add something there? Sorry to interrupt you there, but it's just that I was so interested by what Neil said, and it got me thinking more about design, that if you look at a lot of big old country houses, the design is so seemingly disconnected from where the money came from, because quite often if you've got Palladian architecture, or you've got these great big pillars, you've got some houses which are kind of neo-Gothic. I mean, I'm not an expert in architecture, but quite often you get these places like Penrhyn Castle, which looks like a kind of Gothic castle, and the point being that it was a way of distancing the owners from the origins and the colonial origins of their money. So what appears to be a very old castle is actually trying to get away from the idea that we're new money, we're East India Company nabobs, or we are slave owners or enslavers. So I think it's really also important to think of those aspects of design, even when you're looking at design, and also think about, yes, what do we already know? What research has already been done? How can we put this all together in one place? But also ask questions about where the money came from for any organisation. That's always an interesting set of answers you get from that.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to pick up on Neil's point about, the way the RIBA is spreading globally, that we are speaking about international architecture and international architects in the next hour with Azlina Bulmer, the director of international here at the RIBA.
Marsha, could I just say one more thing about that then, which is, again, it's not just about, under the kind of rubric of decoloniality, just about other architectural institutions internationally. It is critically about other ways of knowing about building and living in an environment, both built and natural. And I think that would become really exciting if the RIBA were able to engage with those different knowledge systems on a kind of equitable basis. In particular in an age of near ecological collapse and climate catastrophe, where there might be some really good ideas about how to live in other epistemic traditions.
It's been a real education, isn't it, Harsha and Jasmine, just listening to these two. The faces, if I may say, you look like you're really absorbing, like you might do in a lecture. But going to you, Harsha, you've got these this campaign, if I can call it that, to decolonize the curricula. What is it that you're actually asking for at this stage from the schools of architecture?
That's a good question. I think I would kind of pick up on what Neil was saying and try and phrase it that way, is that what we're trying to examine is that decolonization, like Neil said, isn't just necessarily about learning about that one, 200, 300-year period, but it's also trying to learn about dismantling the kind of power structures that we do live in, and understanding that colonialism means upholding this certain sense of hierarchy, regardless of whether that's in a social context, an academic context. So I guess what we're looking for is a more nuanced way of being able to speak about this process of like breaking down these power structures and this hierarchy, and trying to make it a level playing field for everyone that wants to get involved in this profession or in this educational process. So I guess that would kind of be like where we are trying to broaden our conversations currently. It's just understanding that decolonization doesn't necessarily have to end up becoming or focus around this notion of race and racial kind of injustice, but it's also genuinely speaking about how the way we are taught things, or the way we operate in the spaces that we live in, does tend to fall into this certain system of being able to be this able-bodied person that can access things the way that they've been designed. And instead of living in this very idealistic, perfect world, creating a space where we understand that flaws and kind of drawbacks do exist. And as long as we know that these broader horizons exist, we start becoming better designers, hopefully. So I guess that's the kind of conversations that we're trying to have at this stage.
And Jasmine, what's the next step for your group?
Well, I think over the past year, we've seen quite a lot of growth. So of course, we each of us on the committee at Decolonise Architecture originates from the University of Bath. And so a lot of our work has kind of stemmed from that university, and we've been involved not just within the architecture and civil engineering department at Bath, but also across different faculties as well, which has been really quite exciting to see. But actually, we've already started making connections at other universities. So we've worked with Glasgow School of Art and recently Cardiff University. And I think we'd really like to continue this trend, because the kind of things that we've been observing and changing at Bath and at these different universities which we've connected to are, of course, kind of representative of universities nationwide, again, kind of linking back to the RIBA and accreditation. And so what we're really eager to do is kind of form this network of students at different universities, which can all work holistically towards the same goal, essentially.
And Corinne, if I can give you the final word on the future and thinking about, there is some hope here in terms of being able to pull apart these conversations. The students working on this and working, broadly on it as well. It should give you some optimism for the work around, decolonisation.
Oh yeah, I've got total optimism. I think that there is so much happening across the heritage sector, museum sector. It's so exciting to hear this conversation about architecture too. And I have every hope. I think there's been a sea change. I think the ship will take a long time to turn, but it's already turning, I'm sure.
Architectural historian Dr. Neil Chassor, Professor Corinne Fowler, Director of Colonial Countryside, and students Harsha Gore and Jasmine Lawrence from the Decolonise Architecture Group speaking to me about decolonisation. If you missed any of that, we'll have it subtitled and up on the YouTube channel as soon as we can. Yes, and the only way is up. Now, I don't know if you caught it earlier, but I was speaking to Marvin Rees, the city mayor of Bristol, and we ended up having a bit of a conversation where we ended a bit tongue-in-cheek. It was tongue-in-cheek. We were taking the mickey about how... architects wear black polo necks and corduroy trousers, and so I thought, let's throw this out to Twitter, #architecture. And Patty, you've been looking after the social media for RIBA Radio. We put it out there on Twitter. How's it going? Is #architecture wearing black and corduroy trousers? What's the outcome so far?
Well, it's been quite divisive. We've got 44.4 saying yes to corduroy trousers and polo necks, black polo necks, and 55.6 no.
No. Oh, now actually you're wearing a black polo neck yourself today as well, and so is the director of comms. So we've got black's definitely happening here. I think we need to also have a wander around to see if people are wearing it actually in as well. So keep an eye on that. Yeah, if you're listening, please go onto Twitter, look up. Are we on hashtag Reba Radio, hashtag architecture, and look out for that Twitter poll on at Reba, and let us know if you are falling within the stereotype or not. But yeah, we're halfway there, so that's interesting. Maybe it's not quite what I thought. Yeah.
New times.
Yeah, it is changing. Because actually, to be fair to Patty here, she's wearing red as well alongside her black. So coming up, we're going to be talking about international architects, the assumptions that are made about them and what they'd like to change as we continue with our CQ strategy. You are listening to Reba Radio, broadcasting live from the bookshop at 66 Portland Place, the HQ of the Royal Institute of British Architects, with me, Marsha Ramroop, the Director of Inclusion at the RIBA. We're 22 hours down with only 6 hours to go. Oh, time is flying. We're bringing you 28 hours of material to help you build inclusion into everything you do, and it's all rooted in that behavioural principle of CQ, cultural intelligence. We've spoken about inclusive design. We've spoken about decolonising architecture. We're now going to talk international architecture and later organisation and self-awareness and impact. We're talking more CQ strategy. It's day 6, the penultimate day of Reba Radio. You are listening to Reba Radio, broadcasting live from the bookshop at 66 Portland Place, where you can hear the atmosphere of people roving, people walking around, using the bookshop, working here at the HQ of the Royal Institute of British Architects. I am Marsha Ramroop, and I'm the Director of Inclusion here, and we're all about CQ, cultural intelligence, the capability to work and relate effectively with those who are different from you. Coming up today, it's the second of our 2 days talking CQ strategy, which is thinking about what you're thinking about. It's about planning interactions, checking your assumptions, and self-awareness. It's all about creating procedural changes to mitigate the impact of hidden bias. And that means talking international architects with Dr. Timothy Onyenobi, Diva Salam, Bing Sheng, and Aslina Bulmer, who's the Director of International here at the RIBA. Coming up after we hear about today's My Soundtrack.
Hi, this is Simon Alford. This evening on Reba Radio between 5 and 6, I'll be playing a tune from artists such as Bob Marley, Paul Weller, Nancy Whiskey, a strange assortment of artists who matter to me, and telling you why.
We are coming live from 66 Portland Place, and just outside the window, they've just started using some kind of saw of some kind. So that's going to be the accompaniment as we talk about international architects. Simon, by the way, marks 100 days at the RIBA as president today, so it really did seem right to have his selection, and I really want to say thank you to him and all our My Soundtrack guests for choosing their tunes and putting in the time to record their shows. When it comes to international architects, they really are. When I was thinking about this, I was thinking, some things really don't translate internationally, and if you know me, I like a bit of karaoke, channeling my inner Trini Nicki Minaj. If you're hanging, we're banging, phone ringing, we're slanging in karaoke night, because get the mic because I'm singing, and I've been asked if I ever perform my signature tune sober. And I got an incredulous, oh, you couldn't possibly. Well, I do. And if I want you to picture this. On this occasion, we're in Antigua. The sun is setting, the light's soft, the all-inclusive hotel, all the crowds gathered. It's my mum's 70th. It's karaoke night, along with my my husband and the girls. We've got some family over, you know, Trinidad and Canada. They've joined us in Antigua. It's a real party atmosphere. But quite frankly, if I'd used my CQ strategy, I'd have anticipated what was going to happen next. Now, the song list was extensive. It's clearly hooked into the internet. I could have chosen any song at all, but I didn't. I chose Kate Bush, Babushka. It's my signature one. And if you're listening outside the UK, you're not alone. We've got thousands of people tuning in from all over the world right now. Search online for the video. Kate Bush has this big double bass, which is a figurative substitute for the husband in the story of the song. And I have been known to replace it for a ukulele in the performance of it. Anyway, the writing really was on the wall when the hosts of this karaoke night didn't know how to pronounce the name of the song. So I'm standing there under this party gazebo, mic in hand, ready with my best bush. And I say something like, they say something like, I don't know how to say the name of this. Babushka! I cry out, Babushka by Kate Bush. And suddenly I realised that this international crowd of tourists, hotel staff and family were not aware of this quintessentially English artist. And I had a choice at that stage. You know, I could have said, oh no, let's do Robert Palmer, you know, Addicted to Love instead, which I do in a very particular way. But I thought, no, you know, forget it. I'm going to give it everything. So the bars of the intro start and I go full, you know, falsetto. She wanted to test her husband. And Kate Bush really lived on stage that night off Jolly Beach in Antigua. But I'm getting nothing from the crowd. And I head for this climactic, you know, breaking glass moment. And I'm blasting into the mic and the hosts just look at me in horror as they try to adjust the mic settings. And I pull out the final, Babushka, yeah. And the song ends. Tumbleweed. Nothing. There may have been a few like pity claps. I don't really remember hearing them. I just pull off the most dramatic bow, trying to hold my dignity together. And I walk over to my aunts and uncles who just like look at me like mouths open, go, what was that? And my girls, they're trying to disown me. They still talk about how traumatic a moment there was in their early childhood. Did I learn my lesson? Yes. I'll do Wuthering Heights next time. Everyone knows that one, right? They all know it. I'm sure of it.
You're listening to Reba Radio, real inclusive, brilliant action with Marsha Ramroop.
Well, learning lessons about going international. As I entered the world of architecture less than a year ago, I've learnt so much about the profession, education, qualifications. And as I approach how we can improve the profession from an inclusion perspective, I was struck by how differently some international architects can be treated. And I really wanted to dive into this, what we can do as a profession, you know, and what we can do about it. And to discuss this, I'm joined by Dr. Timothy Onyenuobi, Diba Salam, Aslina Bulmer and Bing Sheng. And I'm going to start by asking you to introduce yourselves. Say in the world you've called home, what do you think is the perception of international architects in the UK? If I can start with you, Diba.
Oh gosh, you're starting with me. Okay, it's a challenging one. I mean, okay, I'm Diba Salam. I'm the principal and founder of Studio DS. We are an international practice. And we have offices in Dubai and Bangkok. Something that I'm looking at your top 10, poster behind you, unconscious bias is something that we have to all accept that we do have, that in us. And the perception of international architects is, being from Britain and from UK and having a very strong education system here and an architecture culture and system in education that thinks we're very superior to others, and that exists. Let's open up that discussion. And I think that was probably the most challenging thing I had to overcome, and accept that what are the key values that are important to our practice, what are the key values in design. The outcome may be different, but everyone needs to be treated with respect and acknowledge that. Let's understand the education systems in those various countries that we are practicing in.
Thank you. Bin, what, if you can introduce yourself, say where in the world you've called home, and what do you think is the perception of international architects here in the UK?
Sure. It's such a pleasure to be here today. And I'm Bin Shen. I'm partner of PLP Architecture. I'm originally from China, but I've been here for more than 20 years. I was brought up and educated in China, and I also spent a substantial amount of time here. I always compare these two cultures. I think each culture has brought me to be the me I am today, and I benefit hugely from both cultures. There are some conflicts, but I think the world is going to become a more and more mixture in the coming future, because I believe globally we are working towards a more AI, smart, green technology future. This is not just for any single country. This is not for the Western world or Eastern world. It's for the whole Earth.
Thank you. Dr. Timothy Onyenuobi, if I can ask you, introduce yourself. Where in the world have you called home? And what do you think is the perception of international architects in the UK?
My name is Timothy Onyenuobi. I'm the director in my practice, a small practice in Manchester, AA Architecture. I'm originally from Nigeria. I would say that currently, with regards to the perception of international architects, I think to be perceived, you need to be acknowledged that you exist in the first place in terms of being present, because as it stands, the situation of international architects seems not to be at the forefront of the drive for diversity. So I'll just stop at that for now.
Thank you. And can I call you Tim? Timothy?
Yes, please.
Okay, just checking. And Azalina, if I can give that question to you as well, a bit of an introduction. Where in the world have you called home? And what do you think is a perception of international architects in the UK?
Hi, morning, Marsha. I really love your karaoke story. Hard one to beat. I'm originally, hello everyone. I'm Azalina Bulmer. I'm the Director of International. I am originally from Malaysia. I came to this country nearly 30 years ago to study, to go to school here. But Malaysia is very much still home for me, although I'm from a mixed background. I've been privileged to have met so many fantastic architects all over the world, and also international architects in the UK. And in my personal view, international architects in the UK are still not recognised at the same level as UK architects, and there's still a lot more we need to do from our IBA as the institute to promote that. It's all about equity in the profession that we really need to promote quite significantly. I'm going to leave it there as we go into further conversation.
Yeah, and if I could bring Bin in on that, actually, around, that perception of architects not being quite the same. You're trained as an architect,
yes,
are you?
I'm trained
and
as
are you recognised as one in this country?
No, I'm not. I'm not.
Why do you think that is?
I came here quite early in year 2000. Then I wanted to get onto the ARB, but that needs to go through a certain series of recognition as well as pass exams. And there has been some conflict with I need to get on with life. So I have been putting those plans on the side. So even till today, I'm still not recognized as ARB architect in UK.
Yeah, and this is a problem, really, isn't it, Diva? What are your views on that?
It is a problem because, and I think the ARB and the RIBA have got together to try and make this easier. I mean, certainly when we were trying to encourage our architects in Dubai and Bangkok to get qualified, it was challenging, and it was a learning experience for me myself. I mean, I had experience with the European architects pre-Brexit, trying to get qualified under ARB, and it was more simplified. And that in itself is, well, okay, because they're European countries, but it's something that actually we don't realise what a toll that actually takes on people when they have taken so much time, effort, money to invest in being an architect, and then not to be able to be called an architect. I mean, I can say I've got a similar experience where I can go to Thailand, and because I'm not from an ASEAN country, then I can't actually call myself an architect there. And you say, well, I have to do an exam, but then I have to learn Thai, the language, to do that exam. So it's challenging on both sides, and it's recognising that on the international front. And I know Azlina does fantastic work. You know, being a committee member, I think only last year I stopped. This is a very important agenda for the RIBA, to get the schools to be more aligned and to get more engagement, and to basically acknowledge that. I mean, I personally feel that the architects from especially the Asian countries are more rounded. Now, we talk about how architects these days, you know, you in the past you could say, well, I can model really well, and, you know, I can design really well. You know, I've always been an all-rounded architect, and I've always, you know, put science, you know, science and art is together. That is architecture. And I feel the Asian architects in particular are very, very strong on the engineering, the science side. And actually, when you're doing more work, when you're trying to look at more environmentally responsive designs, they're actually more successful than actually our British architects, which is something that we as an institute need to look at in the education system here. So it requires work on both sides, but I can imagine the toll on the mental health and well-being on a lot of architects, and I've personally had to give a lot of support to the architects that I've encouraged and mentored to just hang in there and pursue. It's worth it at the end.
Well, it's a really good introduction to that idea of international architects. We're talking to Dr. Timothy Onyenobi, Diba Salam Bingsheng, and Azlina Bulmer, and we'll have more from them after Ed Sheeran and Khalid with Beautiful People. Coming up, we're talking about organisational and self-awareness. It's a really important part of CQ strategy to ask yourselves, what is it about me? What is it about my organisation which needs to change so I can be better and working and relating with you and yours? So we're discussing this with Professor Jeremy Till of Central St Martin's. And if you missed any of the conversation earlier about decolonisation, you can catch up with this and all of our live content on this Listen Again link as we repeat everything as we come off the live broadcast at 1. Dr. Timothy Onyenobi, Diba Salam Bingsheng, Azlina Bulmer, we're all talking international architects. And just before we went to the track there, Azlina, Diba was making this point about how, you know, there's a real process there which can affect people as they try to navigate it and get their qualifications recognised in this country. What is that process, and why is it currently that way?
There is a process, and Diba has also made a very good point. It does work both sides of the equation as well. Architecture is a highly regulated profession, and therefore there needs to be a process to make sure those that are admitted as architects meet the relevant professional standards. And it is ARB that is responsible for that process. I don't think that, I think it is about maintaining professional standards, but it's about accessibility is where we come to the problem. It's that automatic assumption that anyone that doesn't have a particular set of studies are not eligible to become ARB. Registered with ARB is becoming the more apparent problem. However, if we, as Diba alluded, if you were to go to another country in another part of the world, same process may actually appear with those sets of different regulations. We take Thailand or Malaysia, for example. You know, a UK architect going to Malaysia cannot simply call themselves an architect and practice there either. They would need to do local examination. So it's a much wider issue in the global market. And it is about breaking down that barrier and about RIBA. For me, anyway, RIBA is a global professional organization. We have 50,000 members, and 7,000 of them are based outside the United Kingdom. And what we can do at RIBA is to promote our members and that design excellence and that standards, no matter where they are in the world or where they are from. And it's about starting to move into that direction, recognizing that as an RIBA chartered member, they are at the top of their game, and talking them as a global member instead of being from Thailand or they're from Malaysia as RIBA members in London or where I'm from, York. So it's about breaking down that barriers and talking about architects as the profession, as the professional operating at global level. Because the problem we have in terms of regulations is it does differ from one country to another, and that will take a very long time to break down.
There was a point made in the previous hour, Renwil talking about decolonisation, and Neil Sharshaw was making the point that is the RIBA in danger of imposing its idea of what standards should be, rather than recognising local standards as being equally good or indeed excellent?
I would say no. I think, certainly from an international point of view, we don't do that at all. When we work overseas, we work in partnership with others, and that is absolutely critical. From my point of view, I come from Malaysia, I get colonialism, I get all that. And it is all about working in collaboration. We are not there to take over, far from it. We have an office in UAE, we have an office in Shanghai. We're not there to take over. We work in partnership with local organizations, governments. And what we do is to support them. And I think critically as well, we are learning as well from our partners overseas, which makes us a better organization. So from an international point of view, we're certainly not imposing, we are working with them and learning. And that is absolutely critical for us.
And Tim, you recognise that sort of being in this country, that there's benefits from, getting together with other international architects like yourself. Tell me about some of the work that you're doing with Nigerian architects.
Thank you very much. In 2019, I think, it dawned on me that there were so many Nigerian trained, or let me put it this way, international architecture graduates from Nigeria and the UK, and they were finding it extremely difficult to join the profession. So looking at my own experience, when I joined the profession, I joined it through the ARB. They are the ones responsible for admitting architects, registering architects with international backgrounds. When I joined the ARB, I took the exams. A total, before I finally got through, I took it a total of 7 times in combination. That's the part 1, part 2, and part 3, But then in the process, I realized something, that when I took the exam and failed initially, and when I took the exam and passed eventually, the difference between the two was my understanding of the questions. Not my intelligence, not my skill level, but my understanding of the questions. So with that, I decided to collaborate with the Nigerian Institute of Architects in order to see how we can bring this group of people who are struggling to join the profession, but here in the UK, how we can bring them together. And in that process, I had to organize a sort of survey amongst this group. I did a report, and the survey gave 27 suggestions on what could be done to make things a lot easier. I passed on this report to the RIBA, and this report was further shared with the ARB. As a result, there are current discussions going on with regards to that. However, this group of people, we later on came together and we formed a Nigerian Institute of Architects UK sector here in the United Kingdom, because there were quite a number of people, a lot of people who were in this position who, though they're intelligent, they are graduates of architecture, but they are finding it extremely difficult to join the profession. And just as I feel, a lot of them are failing on a repeated basis. And yeah, so what I now did after bringing everybody together was to decide to discuss with the ARB. I also sent this report I prepared to the ARB, and we are now in conversation regarding the exam process, because I think the bottleneck here is the way the exams are structured, which thankfully is being looked into. You can imagine an examination with 44 questions requirements, and those 44 questions have 3 sub-questions, so a total of 176 questions. And then you have to get each and every one of them correct. And look at the process of getting them correct. The process is that the question might appear objective, but the approval process in terms of whether you've complied with that requirement is very subjective. So from for example, I also met some of the examiners, and I discussed with them, and it was quite obvious that an examiner might pass an individual based on their perception of them having fulfilled certain criteria, while a different examiner might fail that particular individual. It's sort of subjective. That's what I'm trying to say. So thankfully, ARB is looking into that. So I think that's why I mentioned initially with regards to the international graduates being not in the focus. Why I'm saying that is, thankfully, the focus is now, the spotlight is now being shined on them, because in the past, when diversity is being spoken of, it's usually referred to UK-trained graduates, while there are so many international architecture graduates out there not able to go through the ARB hurdles.
And Bin, you probably recognise, I suppose, some of what Tim was saying there, but in terms of, you thinking about how you practice in this country, is it still something that's playing on your mind, your own status?
From my own personal experience, I feel I'm quite lucky. I joined the PLP firm, and we are international firm. We have 39 different nationalities in the office. So there are a lot of people in my office having this problem. They have been in this design practice for probably more than 20 years. They're still not recognized. They are from Japan, from America, and so it's not recognized. Then it's just not recognized. It doesn't stop them doing brilliant and creative work, not at all. So that's we kind of accept this as it is, and then life goes on.
I mean, DB, you were saying earlier that actually for some people it feels like life doesn't go on because they're kind of stuck in this cycle of wanting to be recognised and maybe just trying to navigate the system.
When you look at young architects coming out of university with a huge amount of debt, that's already a burden on their shoulders, on their mind. And then you couple that with trying to get into practices, get on site, get experience. And I think this is where the challenges are for a lot of young architects, is getting that experience, getting that recognition, and, having those ticks next to your name that I am an ARB architect, I can be a principal designer, I can be a project architect. These are hurdles that, stop you from being able to continue with your life, to get doing a course at 7 years. I remember as a young architect, just watching all my other friends buying houses and cars and whatnot. And then, me still sitting there with my, little portfolios. And I was like, I've got to go for a crit now, and my life was just it was staggered differently. And so for architects, that's a reality. That is part of, the 7-year course. And, we talk about salary, pay, that's obviously a problem, especially when it's such an expensive course. So when you start to add these layers of challenges, and then on top of it to be told that actually you're not, some people, it's not that you're not good enough to be an architect, it's the process. It is challenging, and sometimes language and the nuances of language are a hurdle which needs to be acknowledged. And I think, from what Tim was saying, it is being acknowledged. But I think for a lot of younger architects, it is more of an issue, because you could say that time has allowed you to just overcome it, and the success, and having a practice like PLP, which recognise the value of diversity, being an international practice. But you can understand a lot of younger architects are looking at it in a different way. And with mental health being a key issue, I think this is something that I'm particularly concerned about with the younger architects.
We're speaking about international architects with Dr. Timothy Onyenuobi, Diba Salam Bingsheng and Azlina Bulmer.
You're listening to Reba Radio. Real inclusive, brilliant action.
Earlier, I had a conversation with Marvin Rees about inclusive design, and we were both being a bit tongue-in-cheek about stereotypical architects' outfits. So we did a Twitter poll to see if there is actually a stereotype or simply a reality about architects wearing black and or corduroy. Actually, we've got two architects sitting in front of me, both wearing black, one particularly wearing a polo neck, turtleneck. Completely stereotypical here in the studio. Plus, my colleague Anne Cosentino is wearing corduroy. Patty, how are we doing with that Twitter poll? How are we doing? Are architects wearing black and/or corduroy today?
44% yes.
Only 44% yes. I thought it was going to be higher than that, especially given our guests today. I'm talking with Dr. Timothy Onyenuobi, Diba Salam Bingsheng and Azlina Bulmer about international architects. And Diba, before we went to the song there, you were saying about, this pressure of mental health. Is it your sense that this is like the overriding concern of international architects?
I think it's an accumulative effect of many things happening in your journey of becoming an architect, which culminates in, something that we don't pay enough attention to, and that is the mental health. I know with the Black Lives Matter movement last year, just, as an architect, a woman of colour, a Muslim woman of colour, born and raised in London, but it was a time of reflection and realizing that actually it's been exhausting, and acknowledging that it was really sad to see a lot of young people having to come out and just almost cry on the streets, just screaming out their frustration that could we have done more. And I think this is where Reba Radio talking about these issues, it's fantastic to give it a platform, because we need to discuss it. And it's just putting that spotlight that actually there's a lot of pressure on young architects right now, and not just young architects, architects of my age, which are not that young.
You said you.
And my twin sister would be like, we're young. Don't say that. But it is exhausting, and it's recognizing that there are a lot of challenges on the road to becoming an architect, and not getting qualified, not being recognized, and asking yourself, why am I not being recognized? Is it that whole colonial thing that my culture is less superior than this culture? And there's many things that tick around the head, and it's understanding that, recognizing that, and being mindful of that. But as I say, it happens in other countries as well, and I think I'm probably less sensitive to that, because I'm like, well, it happens, but if you're coming down here and this is you're young and impressionable, then it is an issue.
Recognition, definitely a word for you, isn't it, Bin?
Yes, that's right. And in our office, we actually encourage young architects to get qualified. We support them and trying to help them. We do find it is a problem. People coming in at the same time entering the company, but one is from a different region and couldn't get qualified. Another one can get it smoothly within 3 years. So it's kind of not fair. As a company, of course, we would do all we can to support the young people to achieve what they want to achieve. Yeah, to be recognized is so important. It's so important.
Azlina, there are a lot of international, students coming over, or those who've done RIBA accredited courses elsewhere, but then they come here maybe, but that the qualification may still not be recognised automatically. Is that something that might be changed, or is there any work being done on that?
Absolutely. So if a student comes into the UK and have studied RIBA Part 1, Part 2 outside United Kingdom, they're still subject to the same conditions, so they don't automatically recognise Part 1 and Part 2 here. But yes, our education team, led by Jenny, is looking into this among other things, but it is also still working with ARB, ensuring that we bring the right changes, because it is, as we've all alluded, it is about the regulations here that we need to change, and there's some work currently being looked at, thanks to Timothy, who started the work with his report that's currently being discussed between ARB and RIBA. So there are changes coming, but I think it's really important that we picked up on this mental health and young people, because it does have such significant impact on them. It is so hard, particularly post-pandemic and during COVID. It's been so tricky. It's one of the most difficult. I mean, I read law. It's nothing compared to architecture, as I'm now discovering. And it's so much that we are expecting young people to pick up, and if they do want to work here or be recognised, and I think that's what it comes down to, just to be recognised. It's really an important thing that we do need to focus on. And there are other ways that I think RIBA could, and we should always be able to do more. We could always do more. We do such great work with our Futures Architects Network. So I really implore those young people who are not already part of that network, be part of that, so you have your peer-to-peer support. Reach out to us, because that's what we're here to do, to support architects from all over the world, whatever the background is and whatever stages they are. It is really about talking these difficult things that we can make that change.
Tim, when you are working in this country as someone who originated from somewhere else, and you're coming and trying to practice as a professional in this country, what would you like to see other practices do to try to be more opening, more welcoming, more recognise international architects more? What do you want the profession to do?
Well, when it comes to other practices, I think it's best to employ people based on their skill levels. So the thing is, international architects, once they go through the ARB, definitely they can be classed as architects, and then practices could take them on. But going back to the mental well-being aspect, which I wanted to say something about, when it comes to the process of studying architecture, especially in the UK, and mental well-being, I think it cuts across demographics. It affects everybody. That's why I started what I call Mental Wellbeing Cafe, to see how to help out architecture students in terms of mental well-being. But then the challenges faced by international graduates is quite different. It's when you are not able to get registered, it affects their mentality. So what I normally tell them, because they come to me often, as I'm speaking with you, I'm mentoring quite a few. When they fail, they keep on coming to me. What I advise them is this, just to keep their mental well-being centered. I advise them, look, if you fail your exam once, try it again. You fail it the second time, try it again. Fail it the third time, try it again. Just keep making necessary adjustments. Don't give up until you get it, because a lot of them almost give up. In fact, 2 people told me that if not for the meetings we had in my office or in the restaurant, they would have given up. So with regards to that, that's what I'm advising them, though that shouldn't be the norm. But until the changes come, kicks in, and then things become quite fairer, because I expect the UK system to expect equivalence before admitting. The quality should be maintained, but it's just a process of assessment. That's what's being worked on now. That's what I think needs attention. So yeah. This
idea of equivalence, Diba, I mean, is that something that you think is happening?
It's being, only because I've been part of the international committee, the RIBA International Committee, I can see that there is work being done about this. And what I can say as a practitioner, as a business owner, I did get to a point where, when the IPCC report came out on the importance of how we had to target 1.5 degrees for global temperatures, I realised that actually we were approaching our fifth year in practice, and I said, I actually want to have more scientists. I want people with more engineering background. And what that actually meant was I was exposed to a lot more architects of that kind of qualification internationally than I was with UK-based architects. And given the fact that, in the A levels, we do physics, we do maths, we do art, and then it doesn't really get picked up on the education system. The qualification, the intelligence, the potential is there. And I think with the Asian architects, and that's why I raised the Asian architects and Middle Eastern, they almost are trained as engineers. They're very, very practical. They can do the mechanical, the structural, all the scientific parts of, the job where other architects are, well, I don't want to do that, But they can do that, and they see it as part of their job. And I think there's for me, I realise that actually I want to spend more time with my architects in Bangkok. I want to spend more time with my architects in Dubai. And actually the pandemic has allowed me to do that because we're all on Zoom now. So there was no discrimination about, how much time I'm spending with X, Y, and Z. But so I think the reason why I raised earlier the importance of understanding how to design to environmental standards and to science-based targets is that sense of qualification and the equivalence is going to start levelling up. And actually, if anything, in our country, in good old Blighty, we need to up the standards on inputting a little bit more science and engineering in our architecture courses.
Bin, where would you say, the profession needs to go? What do you want to see from it now in terms of the way that it treats its architects from other countries?
I think to be recognized, there are two levels. One is students level. One is people who has already practiced as an architect for a long time, but in a different country. And from students level, if you come into UK, wants to be recognized by the ARB, and it has to follow the British rules. Then I think that's it's a rule. Then if you want to get it, you follow the rule. And if you are qualified, for example, if you're qualified outside EU, outside UK, outside EU, and want to be recognized here, then I think that's a government level trade condition. And I've been joined several DIT talks. And it's a trade condition between two countries come to agreement to be recognized on both levels. It's not a Chinese architect become recognized here in UK. It's also UK architects has to be recognized in China. It has to be fair on both sides.
Aslina, if I could give you the final word to briefly summarise where you think, the RIBA can go in terms of supporting international architects.
I think we are doing some good work, but I think we can do much more with the support of our international members based in the UK and elsewhere. Certainly, we do great thing on Futures Architect. We work very closely with the public policy team at RIBA, working with UK DIT. Bing mentioned that as well, and it's about the trade agreement. There's so much to do there as well to influence government in the UK, and also actually our education team who validates nearly 50 courses outside the United Kingdom. And that's a huge number of future architects of the world here that we can influence and support, and also through our members already in country. There's so much we can do together because, let's face it, the more diverse the profession is, the better design we're going to see globally that's going to address the whole issue that we're all facing, climate change, diversity and equity. So if we focus on that, I'm quite sure that we will be on the right track, but we need to work very closely with our members wherever they are in the world.
Well, you won't find me arguing with that. Thanks to Dr. Timothy Onyenobi, Diba Salam, Bin Sheng and Aslina Bulmer talking about international architects. Plenty to chew over regarding those assumptions that we can make about them and how we can mitigate them.
You're listening to Reba Radio, real inclusive, brilliant action with Marsha Ramroop. Broadcasting your inclusion journey online, 18th to the 26th of November. You're listening to Reba Radio.
You are listening to Reba Radio, broadcasting live from the bookshop at 66 Portland Place. It's the headquarters of the Royal Institute of British Architects, and I'm Marsha Ramroop, the Director of Inclusion here at the RIBA. Holy schmollers! We're 23 hours down. We've only freaking got 5 hours to go. I don't know. Wow. It's like, wow, amazing. I can't believe we've managed to go so far, but we've still got more because we're bringing you 28 hours of material to help you build inclusion into everything you do. And it's all rooted in that foundational behavioral principle of CQ cultural intelligence. We've spoken about inclusive design. We've spoken about decolonizing architecture. We've spoken about international architects. Now we're going to talk about organizational and self-awareness and impact. We're talking more CQ strategy. It is the penultimate day of Reba Radio.
Reba Radio with Marsha Ramroop.
I am Marsha Ramroop, and you are listening to Reba Radio, broadcasting live from the bookshop at 66 Portland Place, where you can hear the atmosphere of people moving, walking around, working here at the HQ of the Royal Institute of British Architects. I'm Marsha Ramroop. I'm working too. I'm the Director of Inclusion here. We're talking about CQ cultural intelligence, the capability to work and relate effectively with those who are different from you. The final hour on our second of 2 days talking CQ strategy, which is thinking about what you're thinking about, planning interactions, checking your assumptions, your self-awareness. It's about creating procedural changes to mitigate the impact of hidden bias. And that means we're talking organisational and self-awareness with Jeremy Till and Indy Johar, and we'll hear from a Baroness Doreen Lawrence later in the hour. And that's after today's
Unsung Hero.
Hello, my name is Rosanna. I am a Part 1 architecture graduate from the Architecture Association, originally from Malaysia, however, have been living here for the past 5 years in order to pursue my Part 1 architectural degree. And my unsung hero is related to the AA and is my boss, Fotis Demetrio, who I have been working for the past 2 years in the print shop. And the reason why he is my unsung hero is not just because of how he helps people behind the scenes, gets prints on time, and puts fires out whenever it's a stressed moment of juries or presentations, but because he personally helped me in a moment where I was in a fork in the road. Post summer of 2019, in which I had worked there since March, my first time ever working, my first job ever, and the summer had proved to be quite turbulent in where I had decided, due to previous health complications, to pause my architectural studies and take a year out in order to revitalize and re-energize myself to tackle third year a lot better. However, the AA did approve that, but not me working, as it would conflict with the component of me saying that I would like to take a year to rest and relax. I remember this moment very clearly, as I was very sad when I had gone to Fotis to tell him how I was sorry that I wouldn't be able to be there. And I was excited, I was really excited initially to work and help him out. But he looked at me and said, "Don't worry about it. Give me a moment. You stay here and man the print shop, I'll be back." So in those few hours of it being bit of a limbo where I didn't know where my future would take me, he came back and said it's all sorted, granting me the opportunity to work there for the next year. He was calm, he was cool, and gave me the confidence to explore and the space to become who I am today. And I would like to take the opportunity once more to thank him so very much for the impact that he's had on my life and that I will continue to be having as I'm still working there. So thank you, coaches.
Wow, what a great story. If you have high CQ strategy awareness, you're really alert to and observant of what's happening in both yourself and your organisation, but also in the person in the organisation that's different to you. And one of the first steps to increase your CQ awareness is to notice but not respond too quickly. Take time to make sense of what you observe. We form a hypothesis, we make a judgment prematurely. We're in danger of being wrong. And one of the techniques to manage this is to describe, interpret and evaluate. So you describe to yourself what's happened to be certain, not to interpret or evaluate prematurely. Consider your description, be sure it's exactly what occurred. Then next, consider an interpretation of what you described, but try to do this without judging or evaluating. And once you're confident that your interpretation is a good one, then and only then evaluate the situation. And if you use this three-step process, it forces you to take your time and be aware. It forces you to create procedural changes to mitigate that impact of hidden bias. Now, Jeremy Till and Indy Johar, they're joining me to discuss organisational and self-awareness. And I'm going to ask them, if I could, to introduce yourself, but also to state whether you think that those in the architecture sector are generally organisationally aware. If I can start with you, Jeremy.
So I'm Jeremy, I'm Head of Centre St Martin's and Pro-Vice Chancellor of the University of the Arts. And so in answer to your question, I mean, it's difficult to kind of have a blanket answer, but I'm kind of concerned within the architectural profession that in placing itself and positioning itself as a liberal institution, and the RIBA doing that, I think it actually takes too much for granted in those kind of liberal views. And you can actually see that in some of the so-called more conservative professions, such as law, that actually positive action has been ongoing for much longer than it has in the architectural profession. So I think it's also sort of being quite honest with ourselves about where we stand in relation to these issues, and not assuming that because we are a liberal profession that those liberal values are carried through in the way that we respond to issues such as diversity and inclusion.
We'll pick up on that idea of it being a liberal profession shortly, but Indy, could you introduce yourself and state what you think about the organisational awareness of those in architecture?
Yes, my name is Indy Johar from Dark Matter Labs. I suppose I would say that the architecture profession is undereducated in terms of actually management and organizational theory and capacity. I mean, I think it's a fundamentally, you don't look for organizational innovation in architecture. You hardly ever see it. And I think we've been lagging, I would say, large scale contemporary business as an organizational framework for a while. I think that's just a function of the nature, that's a structural function of the nature of the profession, nature of education, and also I think to do with the medium, small size nature of the organizational structures that architecture works in, and also it's to do with the economics of it. So I want to put it down that I think there's a much more structural lag going on in terms of the organizational capacity of the profession itself. And organizational innovation takes investment capacity, specialism, which I just don't think we invest in.
That point, actually, that's something that I've really picked up on, not only just speaking to so many people across RIBA Radio, but the fragmented nature of the profession. There's a sense that even whilst you're at doing architecture school, that sense that the ideal is to leave and set up on your own. Does that play into this idea of not having a coalesced approach to organisational development? Indy?
I mean, so I think this is a really important point, but it has very subtle nuances in it, which I think are worth mentioning. So if our profession is designed around egocentric designers, i.e. the idea of an ego design, then the idea of the idea of fragmentation becomes inherent in the profession itself, because it's actually not healthy for lots of people to be suppressed by the thesis of a single ego. So I think if we want to make a transition, we have to start to think about a post-ego design modality, and that requires quite a different behavior, and that would then unlock that. So I don't blame people for wanting to set up their practices. I think that's a function of the nature of what we're prioritizing, and as a result of it, we get massive losses. So to set up an organization takes 3 to 4 to 5 years to get to the same level as what organization you left. Maybe the investment is significant. We don't get any of the knowledge accumulations. We don't get much of the aggregate effects as a result of that. So I think it is an issue, but I think it goes back to something much more profound, which is the nature of how we design. Are we an egocentric design system, or are we actually an outcome-centric design model? And I think that has fundamentally different behaviors, and with there lies everything else.
Jeremy, you're nodding away there with that idea. What is it you agree with most?
I completely agree with Indy about the lack of kind of organizational nous. But I think also that beyond that, and I agree also the kind of fragmented nature of the profession makes these kind of more overarching discussions difficult. But what I do think that we need to face up to is still the prevailing values as a whole about architectural culture, in which you still are working with pretty much a patriarchal system of power. And that is reflected in what Indy said through the egocentric nature of so much of the profession, in which, only 10 years ago, I called out the Royal Institute of Scottish Architects for having a male-only conference, only 10 years ago, that was seen to be an acceptable thing to do. And when I called them out, they said, well, we've got to keep our quality up, which is kind of a disgraceful thing to say. And even now that Part W, who I've got huge respect for, are calling out the World Architecture Festival for having a lineup which is mainly male. They do have women, but completely white. So there is within our culture a whole set of systems and values which really need to be called out and need to be challenged. And if we are going to get to, and we need to face that really honestly, as institutions should be doing anyway.
So, Indy, what would you like to see these institutions do in order to become more aware and tackle those values as they're being perpetuated at the moment?
I think, again, it's such a big question at so many different levels, right? So I think everything Jeremy said is absolutely right. And I think, however, I kind of also worry that I think there's a fundamental question in play, which is architecture has been, and certainly the architectural profession has been, a function of capital and has been a function of actually a patriotic capital structure largely. So, and that goes to Jeremy's point, which is kind of the illusions we tell ourselves. The RIBA is not an advocate of spatial justice. It's not an advocate for the just spatial environments for all citizens in the UK. Right? It's an advocate for good design, or what it perceives to be good design. And I think the problem starts at that level in a way. What are we benchmarking ourselves towards? If we benchmark ourselves from a theory of what we perceive as good design, peer-reviewed in some fashion, and even if it's sustainable, there's a really much more structural question about are we advocates for the outcomes and the just outcomes for everyone in the UK and beyond, in which case would be a very different profession and would also be a very different type of presentation of the RIBA. Its front page would be arguing about spatial justice. its annual conference would be about actually the lack of spatial justice in the UK, and be a State of the Union around the environmental spatial justice of the story. So I think this does go right to the root of how we cognitively structure the profession. And I think that we are miscognitively structured. And if you talk about spatial justice, then instantly you're talking, in my view, I think you're talking about spatial justice from multiple perspectives, multiple points of view, and the plurality of needs that are required in society. And I think that changes us quite fundamentally. So I would almost go to that root cause again as a mechanism to answering it. Then there are loads and loads of practical. I don't want diversity to be a SOP. Diversity is not a SOP. It's a point of intelligence. It's not a political game. It's a point of actually unlocking the maximum capacity of society. And it's about multiple perspectives which make us smarter. Neurodiversity makes us smarter as a collective system. So I think this isn't a sort of a loss-making story, a kind of some beneficial story. Or let's be a little bit more fair on a moral perspective. I think this is about actually us as society, including the whole value of society in a way that's deeply profound. But it does go, I would say, to the heart of the profession. And what are we standing for? Are we standing for the spatial justice of citizens, or are we standing for the theory of good design structured by capital?
Jeremy Till and Indy Johar, we're discussing international, organisational and self-awareness. And we'll have more from them after the communards. Tomorrow, the final day of live broadcast of Reba Radio OMG. Can't believe it. We're talking CQ action, adaptations that work, supporting the underrepresented, inclusive outcomes, and we're going to have a final panel with the RIBA and ARB representation talking about how we move forward with inclusion in the sector. We're talking to Jeremy Till and Indy Johar about organisational and self-awareness. And before we went to the communards there, and don't leave me this way, Indy was talking about the institutions needing to really look in the mirror and look at spatial justice. When we're talking about the RIBA here, actually, Jeremy, can you clarify who do you have in your mind when we're discussing the institutions of the profession?
Oh, I don't really want to answer that one because I'll probably get rude. So let me just pick up Indy's incredibly important point about the confusion about the role of the RIBA, and it's presenting itself in terms of the promotion of so-called good design, when actually when you look at it, the good design is normally valued in the award system through a kind of form of polite and refined modernism. But where I can be optimistic is a piece of work that was chaired by Peter Oborn, which Indy was involved in, which is the RIBA Ethics and Sustainable Development Commission. I'm just going to read out the first thing which they say, because this is the way forward. This would crack much of what Indy has said. RIBA Council, so this is approved by RIBA Council, reasserted the Institute's unequivocal commitment to placing public interest, social purpose, ethics, and sustainable development at the heart of its activities. So my call, and I think Indy would agree with me on this, is to hold the RIBA Council accountable and responsible to deliver exactly that commitment. And if they did that, then much of what you're trying to do, Marsha, would come with it, in terms of public interest, in terms of ethics, in terms of diversity, not as a token thing, but as a way of seeing the world in a much more inclusive and generous manner. And so that's what I would say, that's where the Institute should be holding itself accountable.
You both mentioned this idea of ego, and it's been quite an ego-driven profession, and that idea of self-awareness is very much key to being successful at mitigating the impact of hidden bias, which we all have. How do we break something like that when it's so inherent in the architectural education system? Indy, I'm going to point that one to you.
I suppose I'm not. I think we should. I suppose I'm very just conscious of just being nuanced about all this stuff. I think it's so when I talk about ego, I mean it from a philosophical sense, not a kind of just we all have ego, right? So what I talk about is a design strategy which is based on selling individuals, and there's a design and economy based on actually the individualization, the heroization of work in a very particular way. And that has a very particular way of organizing it. So I don't want to sit here lambasting individual architects, because I think they're just a function of the system that's generated in the media system. Actually, that relies. I mean, what was it? I was part. We did the Wiki House, and Ted turned around and said, "Well, we can't put up your whole community. We can only put up one person, right?" Because they said, well, only one person really can represent this. So the media system actually also centralizes and constructs egos and takes huge effort to actually go counter those positions. So I think we just have to be careful about this stuff, to not do a kind of very simple ego bashing story or whatever design bashing story, because I think this is a system scale problem and it requires system scale responses from all partners. So I just wanted to say that I think it's important that I do think you're right about unconscious bias. I think the unconscious bias occurs because of many, many factors. One, I think the economics of architecture is fundamentally problematized, which means that actually people are making pretty poor decisions generally. Forget about for diversity, they're just making generally poor decisions because of the economics of architecture. Secondly, and that means that actually recruitment, and every organization I know, most organizations I know are small, so the actual recruitment infrastructure isn't strong enough. The investment in the recruitment infrastructure isn't strong enough, which means that actually addressing these questions is not there. So this is genuinely a system scale problem, which is actually rooted in the deep economics and mission and media system of architecture at that level, which then I think is perpetuating a very particular model of architecture, and also the capital structure. Who commissions architecture? So there is a whole scale issue, which I think is really worth us reflecting on, because I think it requires us to be honest about that and then work in a really smart way to deal with that. And it requires new protocols, right? So if you're publishing a building, you would always credit all the people involved. You'd invite, all sorts of subtle things, reduce the ego infrastructure of architecture and highlight the collaborative framework of that piece as well. And that also drives a different form of intelligence and capability in that system. So I'll leave stuff. I'm sure Jeremy's far more eloquent than me on this.
Jeremy?
Well, just to pick up on what you said about education. So the whole education model is predicated on the individual, but what the RIBA comes to look at is the lowest pass portfolio and then the top ones. They get obsessed about the lowest pass portfolio of an individual. Now, that individual may not be very good at drawing pictures, which is what a portfolio is, but they may have fantastic negotiating skills, or they may have fantastic organizational skills, but those aren't credited, or more importantly, fantastic group working skills. So the whole system of education is indeed predicated on the individual performance, which then sets a set of dominoes going in relation to how the profession values itself and structures itself. So I think it does start in education. So when I once put forward the whole of Sheffield MArch for the RIBA Silver Medal on the grounds of their life projects, which I thought at the time were quite extraordinary, as a collaborative effort, it was dismissed out of hand. So we're not allowed to do that because we only look at individuals. Luckily, about 5 years ago, from London Met, a group was awarded the RIBA Silver Medal. So there's a bit of scope there, but we do need to look at the structures and values of architecture education too.
Well, thank you so much to Indy Johar and Jeremy Till for joining me. A really fascinating discussion, only barely scratching the surface of a very, very deep and meaningful subject. Hopefully, over time, we can get into it a little bit more. But for now, here's Shanice. And thank you both to my guests for joining me.
You're listening to RIBA Radio, real inclusive, brilliant action.
We have invited 7 special guests from the worlds of architecture, design, arts and culture to present a pre-recorded music hour between the hours of 5 and 6 p.m. each day. And these guests, they're sharing personal stories, unique insights, and that's reflected by their choice of top tunes coming from all areas of the musical spectrum. And today, as he marks 100 days in his role, we have the president of the RIBA and director of AHMM, Simon Alford. So do listen to Simon recalling some personal stories, some key music influences from Jane Birkin to Jimmy Cliff and the Sex Pistols. And earlier, I had a conversation with Marvin Rees about inclusive design, and we were both being a bit tongue-in-cheek and stereotypical about architects' outfits. So we did a Twitter poll to see if the stereotype is a stereotype or it's simply reality. So we've asked Twitter, Architecture Twitter, are you wearing black and or corduroy? So Patty, what's the latest with that poll?
41 yes.
41 yes.
58 no.
58 no. I just don't believe it. I mean, even our guests and those on Zoom, they were all wearing, quite a lot of them, they're black. So I don't believe Twitter. I don't think you're telling me the truth today. We'll see. Anyway, Baroness Doreen Lawrence, she needs very, very little introduction. Her son, Stephen, was an aspiring architect before he was murdered. And she's been working with the RIBA and in the architecture profession ever since to highlight the issues of race in the sector and to support young people with potential to enter the profession. And she really very kindly agreed to spare her time so she could share her experience with the profession and insight with you.
After Stephen's death, I think how society, how they view people within the black community and young black men especially, and the fact of how Stephen was murdered, it seems to me that nobody was really interested. And Stephen wasn't just the only young black boy to have been murdered before him. And so Stephen became one of many. And I felt that I needed to, I presume, be his voice now because he no longer had a voice. So I start challenging the police, the justice system, of how they investigate, racial murder, especially around my son. And so without me actually knowing how far I would get with it, I was just being, this is my phone because, the fact that how my son was murdered and nobody wanted to know, society did not want to know, the government did not want to know. And so that is where my journey started.
Do you think the conversation around racism has changed much in the last couple of years?
Yes, the conversation definitely has changed, especially when you look at what happened around George Floyd and Black Lives Matters. Once upon a time, that would never have happened here. The march that took place around Black Lives Matters. There's been marches over the years after the Newcastle fire and other racial incidents. There has been marches, but nothing has made the impact as what happened, especially during the COVID when people were supposed to be locked down in their houses. People took to the streets because they were so passionate about wanting to see change happen within the black community.
And you've taken that sort of emotion, that passion and that need for a change and justice to create a number of different initiatives so that we can have some kind of racial justice in our world. Can you tell me a little bit about some of those actions that you've taken, especially around the creation of the foundation and the trust?
Well, the trust was created back in '98, and now we've not moved away from the trust. Now we've got the foundation. But initially, it was around looking at architecture, but that's what Stephen wanted to go into. And how do we support young black, especially men, into achieving what their ambitions were to become an architect? So by having discussions and set up the Stephen Lawrence Architectural Bursary, and talking to the RIBA at the time, which was Marco Goldschmidt, who was president back in '98. And from there, I started to talk to even the Architectural Association, the AA, and where we've had students studying there as well to become architects. So there's all those initiatives that I felt was important for me to have, and for students to understand about, some of them about architecture, and also the practices. Because I think practices wasn't really engaging that much with our black students. So they would finish their first degree, not being able to have a placement, and then into their part 2 and their part 3. So it's really difficult for students. So it's having those dialogue and start raising those issues I think that seems to have made a difference. And, you know, as I say, the students that who come into the trust at the time, it's by word of mouth. They've heard about the trust, heard about the bursary that we were providing, and it's trying to link all those two things together with the practices, because without the practices, the students are studying, but they're not able to move forward. And so many students will drop out after their first degree. They're not able to get to do a placement. So those sort of things I was trying to change, and it has changed over the years.
When you first started with that work in architecture, how did practices respond to your highlighting the fact that there may be an issue with race here?
It was very poor. I must say it was very poor to get, you know, because, you know, like white students will have the connection of their parents, whether they're an architect themselves or know somebody, whatever it is, practice to help. I think for Black kids, they find it really difficult because they don't have that background. And so trying to engage with practices, I mean, so there's quite a few practices who are beginning to engage with us and give us some fund to able to support students. So it was hard. I'm going to say, you know, I think the first students we ever supported were students in Jamaica, because they heard about us, and students over there was still have the same problem, not having the financial support in order to get them to the next stage of their, you know, their masters or whatever. And so we were able to give them some money. And so those are the first students to graduate was in Jamaica. And as time's gone on, because I wanted to be able to support students in Jamaica, that's where I was born and where Stephen's buried. South Africa, because of the support I had from Nelson Mandela during the early stage of our campaign to get justice for Stephen. And of course, this country where Stephen was born. So we had these three things going on. And over the years, we were able to do all three up until the recession started. When getting funding was really difficult. So we weren't able to support Jamaica or South Africa anymore, which was really sad because, you know, for me, that was why that was really important. I wanted to continue that, but financial stopped me from doing that. And I'm trying to eventually, so I went to visit South Africa a couple of years ago to try to make that link again, you know, because we had about 5 students studying in Cape Town. So, you know, I think, you know, Stephen's name has made a difference, not just in this country, but, you know, internationally as well.
So what, in terms of like that sort of dialogue now changing, not only in the way that architectural practices, the way that they were, but that whole context of speaking about race being different now, what more should architectural practices and members be doing in order to support not only, you know, causes like the Stephen Lawrence Foundation, but generally supporting racial justice as an idea?
I think they just need to open their doors even more and see. I mean, the students who are studying at university, they need to start making visits and encouraging students to say, you know, this is who we are, and this is, you know, we are a firm of architects, and we'd like to invite you to come and visit us. So I think they just need to open their doors more. I don't think enough of them is doing that. I think sometimes they may want to do that, but probably they don't know how to. But, you know, and that's where I think the foundation is best placed to help support that, because we've got a reputation, we've got a name, and people recognize that, and so does other practices, you know. And so I think sometimes the RIBA probably need to step out of its comfort zone and start looking at how to engage with people from ethnic minority. I mean, so there's ethnic minority firms out there. How does the RIBA engage with them? So those are the sort of things I think they just step out of their comfort zone and start looking at ways and see how they can support and promote racial equality.
So what do you and what does the foundation do to support and help practices and architects with the how to be better at engaging with underrepresented racialized groups?
I just I need to point out that the foundation is really new, so we just sort of existed in just over a year, so we're quite new. And so our first link now is with the London School of Architects. That's where our first link has started, which we want to promote a bit more. And as we have the 3 C's, which is classroom, community, and careers, is to build on our careers side around the architectural side of things, so that we can start engaging again. Because I think, as I said, because the foundation is new, we've not been able to engage as much, and plus the pandemic has happened, so those sort of things have put a stop to a lot of things that we could have done. So now as things begin to open up a bit more, is how do we start, and I mean, so it doesn't need us to get in touch with practices, they need to get in touch with us also to say, these are the opportunities that we have. Because why should we the one that keeps banging on your door? You can come knock on our door and say, this is the opportunity that we have here. Can you help us to engage with students who want to become architects or who are studying at the moment and need placement? So, you know, it's a two-way street, and I like to see the practices start engaging with us.
And so once you've done that, how do you measure how successful you are at engaging, you know, practices with underrepresented racialized groups and pushing them towards architecture?
I think that all depends on how the students feel comfortable, because I think they're the ones, the word of mouth can go out. And I think once between the foundation and the students who are taking part and the practice, they can hold their hand up and say, here we are, this is what we're doing. And for us as an organisation to start highlighting on our website, so we're engaging this way. And that's how you can start making those impacts. Because if you don't have some people outside can see what you're doing, then you can work as hard as you can, but nobody knows what's going on. So, you know, I want to be able to engage, use our website, use whatever things that means that we have to promote where companies are engaging with us, and for them to see us as where to say, if you want to know more about how to engage with young people, look at the Stephen Lawrence Foundation and see what they're doing.
So any sort of looking back as well at the work that you've done with the Trust, any really good sort of outcomes that you like to think about and reflect on?
We've had brilliant outcome because we have students, well, they're not students anymore, they're practicing architects who set up their own firm. And so they're engaging, and even at the Sterling Prize last month, I bumped into one of our students who is engaging and is part of the RIBA. I can't remember exactly what her position is, but she's part of the RIBA now. So that's a really good story that the RIBA can promote of what they're doing to support students, and for us to know that she had studied in Stephen's name. So there's a good story out there.
And in terms of what the future holds for the foundation, continuing to ask people about, you know, the impact that they're making and joining some dots, you know, what would you say is the future, and what are your hopes for racial justice, architecture, the RIBA?
For me, as I mentioned about the 3 C's, so looking at the education, the community, and the careers. We've just appointed a new project manager, because as I say, we're quite new. So we're taking steps to make sure that we have be in the right position to support wherever we can, which is what our project manager will be doing. So we'll be engaging with the RIBA more than what we've done in the last year, because we've not been in a position to do that. So as we go forward, is how do we, I think for me, is finding that position that we can now, you know, because I think unless you have somebody helping you to do all of that, you just stay in one place. As we progress into the future, that's how I see the foundation. The Stephen Lawrence Day is going to be next year, April. And so we're engaging with the De Montfort University, who's got Stephen Lawrence Centre. They already, and there's archives there. So there's many things. So we were engaging with the police cadets. That's something we're going to continue to do with the fire cadet. The Princess Trust we've been engaging with, and we're going to continue to do that. So the variety of things that we've done already, and we want to build on that, because I think that's how come we can make a difference as a foundation. And for people to see that as an organization, we are making steps to address equality, address racism, and address and working with government and the broader community, so that, you know, that young people can feel that they are part of society rather than just outside looking in.
Baroness Doreen Lawrence, and you'll be able to catch up with that and see the full subtitled interview on Reba's YouTube channel.
You're listening to Reba Radio, real inclusive, brilliant action.
Gosh. 6 days down. Just one more to go. It's been a packed day on Reba Radio today. We've been exploring planning, checking awareness on day 6 CQ strategy. We've heard from Marvin Rees, Julie Fleck, Zoe Partington, Ian McKinnon, Dr. Neil Chassor, Professor Corinne Fowler, Harsha Gore and Jasmine Lawrence, Dr. Timothy Onyonobi, Deba Salam, Azlina Bulmer, Bin Sheng, Jeremy Till, Indy Johar and Baroness Doreen Lawrence. It's been packed, it's been interesting, it's been insightful, as all the shows have been. It's been real, inclusive, brilliant action. Tune in tomorrow for more help with your CQ, your cultural intelligence journey on the final day of live broadcasting. We're talking CQ action, adaptations at work, supporting the underrepresented, inclusive outcomes. And we're going to have a final panel with the RIBA and ARB representation, talking about how we can move forward, how we move forward with the inclusion journey in this sector. We'll have the outcome of the prize draw, so get onto architecture.com now if you would like to enter. We'll close that draw at 11 a.m. tomorrow. Thank you. Thank you for listening to day 6 of Reba Radio. I'm Marsha Ramroop, Director of Inclusion at the RIBA, and I'll be with you again for the final time tomorrow at 9 o'clock.
You've been listening to Reba Radio, real, inclusive, brilliant action.